So today we're going to be continuing to take a look at a scenario where civilization starts over. We are now on episode 81 of this series, and in the previous episode we saw a major event happen, so if you haven't seen the previous episode, definitely make sure to go watch it before watching this one, spoilers ahead. But yeah, that major event in the last episode was the start of the War of the Elites, aka World War V. If you guys do enjoy today's video, make sure to leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel if you're new. Check out the membership program in the Discord server in the link in the description below, and let's go ahead and jump straight into this. So the largest war in WICSO history has commenced. Currently, the Assembly of Nations is in a complete panic. Remember, the Assembly was made to stop global war, and yet here we are. The non-participating member states as well as the non-participating Security Council states will all convene together and try to figure out what exactly happened and what they can do to try to stop this war. In the meantime though, fighting will begin all over the world. In America, the unexpected joining of California in the China's alliance means that when California troops begin to invade, America is taken by surprise and they end up losing a major city. Now, California was one of these countries that was secretly being influenced by China and secretly had become a Chinese ally, but on the world stage they never admitted that and they never showed it, which is why we see American forces losing here to Californian forces at first, and as we all know, this is the element of surprise. Now, California's troops do a really good job pushing into American territory, and more specifically, the American troops in this area that are just here for defensive forces are simply outnumbered by both Californian, West Mexican, and Chinese forces. So yes, Chinese military forces were also already staged here in this part of California. A big encirclement is made of some smaller American divisions who are all wiped out, and up north, the Californians will start another front and invasion into America, now heading towards these two major cities over here in what is like probably Nebraska, and then over here into what is probably a Dakota or Montana. Now you might be asking yourself, what are the main American forces doing at this point? Well, the US government knew that their mission in India could be a very risky one and that it can escalate into a war with China, so they went ahead and did their due diligence and sent their troops to areas which they thought that fighting could occur. So American troops are currently in Mexico, currently stationed in the Caribbean islands near Brazil, and most prominently, they're stationed in India. Now what about the bombs that were destroyed? What about the non-nuclear high-radius bombs? I haven't really talked about those yet. This is America's answer to the nuclear question. This is their replacement for nuclear bombs. Now, these bombs do not defy any treaties because they're not nuclear. There's no radiation effects. They are simply just ginormous blast bombs. They just, decimate cities, just without the radiation. What countries have them? Well, the only answer to that question is America. Remember, the ones in India were destroyed. That's how we got to World War V. Now, what about the range of these bombs? Can they reach other countries? The answer to that is no, hence why they were being shipped to the border of India and China. The range of these bombs is very, very short distance, which highlights the fact that they are very prototypical bombs, and they aren't necessarily ready for deployment in the combat zone just yet, other than like short range distances. So, will America be using any of them on any of the countries around them? We'll have to see. But for now, we head down over here to the Mexican theater, where Mexico and West Mexico will be fighting. Now, these two nations have fought before, they've had diplomacy before, and the history between these two countries is very, very extensive. In World War III, this was a hot zone. World War IV took a little bit of a break, but World War V, it's once again active. And this comes after really the sovereignty of West Mexico has been achieved. Remember, this used to be a terrorist state, but since then it has developed itself into an actual democratic country. It shares very similar democratic values to its neighbor over here in Mexico, but at the end of the day, ideology means nothing in this war, as the elites have their fingerprints all over it, and influence and money plays a much larger role. So as you can see here, the West Mexicans are being absolutely obliterated by the Mexicans, and this is largely thanks to the fact that once again American troops are already stationed in Mexico. So yes, this is the Mexican army, but it's also the American army here that is helping out Mexico. Now, that is probably subject to change because the Americans are going to be pulling some troops back up north to fight off California, who they didn't expect to join this war. But for now, we see Mexico do a very good job at invading into West Mexican territory. This country is not very strong, and that's largely due to the fact that it doesn't have a very extensive and stable history, whereas Mexico has been established a little bit longer and has had a much better time at developing itself. So for now, we're going to take a break from the North American theater and head over here to the European theater, and more specifically the theater between Russia and the Pink Team. This is a one-on-one war happening over here. Now, I did say that other countries could and will join this war, but for now, this is just the initial fighting that we see take place. Sure, over in North America, it was a lot, but that's mostly due to the fact that America and Mexico are a lot stronger than California and West Mexico. Here, the fighting might be a little bit more balanced, a little bit more even, especially considering the fact that Russia is probably a top 20 power at this point, and the Pink Team probably isn't too far behind, simply due to the fact that the American military complex has been rapidly selling weapons to the Pink Team and training their army to the point where they could probably put up a little bit of a fight. Now, since the 3-Point Star Alliance was already convening on whether or not to get involved in this war, that means that these countries were preparing to get involved before the decision was officially made. So if they didn't get involved, then they would have just pulled back their forces, but they put their forces on high alert anyway, just in case the decision was to go, and that decision was to go. So at first, the 3-Point Star Alliance is definitely going to have a slight advantage against the Triangle team, who is technically the defender in this war, even though they officially declared war as well, shortly after the 3-Point Star Alliance declared their war. If that doesn't make any sense to you, basically, the 3-Point Star Alliance declared war on China because they blew up bombs in Indian territory, and China declared war on the 3-Point Star Alliance because American operatives were in their capital city. So they both declared war on each other, but America did it first. Anyway, the Pink Team's invasion of Russia is going pretty well. They managed to capture a major city over here in the former Yellow Country. Eventually, forces begin to pour into these major cities down here as they are welcomed with open arms by the recently captured people of the former Yellow team. So a lot of success is seen down here. Eventually they do encircle the Caspian Sea area and liberate all of it. But back up north, the Russians have been focusing on a different area of the Pink team and aren't really too worried about the southern area that the Pink team has just captured. You see, the Russians are focused on pushing back all of these invading forces, which they do, and taking this major city right here, which they also do. From here, forces will begin to pour into the Pink team, and more specifically, they start to bunch up over here to the east of this major city in an attempt to go ahead and push across the Pink team and reach their capital city. Now, such a military conquest would be a very long and extensive one, and they need to build their forces a little bit more, and also at the same time, they need to work on pushing back Pink team forces, which they start to do in the north, and little by little in the south. You see, they take back that major city there, and also start to round off these forces over here, but unfortunately, the Pink team has been pretty dug into this area, and with the help of volunteer forces from the cities of this area, the Pink team is able to defend against the Russian counteroffensive. But unfortunately for them, back up north, things still aren't going so well, as the Russians continue to push into Pink team territory and now have a very large portion of the northwest of this country under their control. Over here on this front line, things are getting pretty rough for the Pink team, as Russian forces are doing their best to push towards the former capital of this country and to cut off this large area down here from the rest of the Pink team, hence meaning they cannot be supplied, and hence meaning they can also move in and eventually take over the area. Now though, we're going to head over to the front line in the East Asian theater, and this is where the most of the fighting is taking place as of now. There are many fronts to this war over here, but more specifically the front between China and India, the front between South China and Vietnam, and the front between Manchuria and Korea. So the first bit of fighting that happens in the entirety of the World War, as well as this region, is when those Indian special forces begin to chase back in the Chinese territory and follow the troops from China that entered into their territory. This little invasion by India goes pretty well until it doesn't, and eventually they're stopped by the main Chinese forces, and those main Chinese forces will of course be pushing back this little, I guess not small unit of Indian forces, because they did just take over a lot of land, but this small branch of the Indian special forces. Eventually they'll be pushed all the way back to the border, and now the main Indian forces are meeting up with the main Chinese forces, and well, they just kind of, for now, not entirely evenly matched because China is stronger than India, but India at this point also has the help of American troops that are already here, and at that point now they are just bumping off of each other and no progress is being made. Now the same cannot be said elsewhere, and more specifically on the front line between Vietnam and South China, because Vietnam has revenge on their mind. They did not forget what just happened to them recently, and they did not forget the fact that, well, China, and also technically South China, took a bunch of land from them. Now sure, they kind of freed the people of this region, which means that the polling of people within Vietnam says that some people are in support of the war, but also a lot of people want to stay out of the war because the Chinese government did free us from our last government. But as time passes on, more and more people are starting to realize the state of the current world order, and the fact that what happened to Vietnam wasn't just about freeing the people. In fact, it was more so to do down here with the Malacca Strait. Now, some people within this 3-Point Star Alliance said not to invade into Malacca, while others said that that is exactly what you should be doing and you should be targeting Malacca. The orders are very unclear. And at the end of the day, the Vietnamese military will just make the decision to do it anyway, because China is an enemy. Why would we not invade their territory? So all local forces here in Malacca are eventually either retreating or killed, and Vietnam will also top it off by capturing this Chinese island over here, and China is kicked out of this area of the ocean. That doesn't go over too well for them, and eventually they'll start to send their army into South China to push back against Vietnam. But it could be said that their main interest right now is against an ancient rival, and that of course is, well, the actual Korean country. So Manchurian and Chinese forces will start to enter into the north of Korea, and this war for Korea is going to be a very short one, because the sheer amount of forces that are sent into Korea are far beyond any expectation that the 3-Point Star Alliance had. After it is very apparent that Korea will not be able to hold out, they start to evacuate both their citizens, their government, and their military over here to Japan, as China and Manchuria begin to decimate this little peninsula. Eventually, the military will be in full-on retreat and begin to evacuate the island, following their citizens over here to Japan, meaning that they basically just abandon all of Korea. Anyone that is left over is encouraged to hide in their residence and not to leave under any circumstances, especially if Chinese or Manchurian forces are nearby and in the area. At this point, it is unknown whether the Chinese forces will be aggressive toward Korean citizens or not, but it's safe to assume that it's better just to avoid them than it is to try to confront them or, just don't get shot, basically. Now, Korea is the first country to fall in this war, and they did so, like I said, very quickly. Now, what is a country like Australia going to do in this war? They don't really border anybody. Well, Australia, for the most part, is going to be a support country, meaning that they are going to be supplying their allies in this war. More specifically, they're going to be working to supply China, but they'll also work to supply the other fascist countries, both in Africa and in South America. And their navy will also be working around the waters of the Indian Ocean to intercept enemy ships and enemy shipments to countries or allied countries. But it's unlikely that we see Australia experience any kind of direct conflict with another nation, unless we see like the Indonesian countries join, but we'll have to see. For now though, we're jumping over to Africa because there is a front line over here, and it's a front line between two former allies, West Africa and the Orange African country. Now at this point, it is important to say that the fascist order, or more so the fascist world order, which isn't technically an alliance, but it's an idea, is fully involved in this war. There is not a single fascist country on this map that isn't at war right now. So the South American fascist order, which is actually an alliance, and then you have Australia, who is the only fascist country in that side of the world, and then you have the Orange country in Africa, which is where we're focusing on right now. These guys all join on the side of China for a reason, but the Orange African country's reason is a little bit more interesting. Yes, they're going to help out their fascist allies, but also there were apparently plans by Americans to colonize this country. Now, colonize is a word that the Orange African country is going to use. I guess you could call this over here in the Suez Strait, that is a colony of America in Egypt, but they were looking to do something very similar over here in West Africa. So better to try to stop it now in this global war than to just sit back and eventually let it happen if the Americans come out on top. But at the same time, that also comes with a consequence, and that consequence is fighting against your former ally and also one of the strongest countries in the world, West Africa. And not only West Africa, because, well, the Europeans have something they need to do, and so do the Libyans and the Mediterraneans. So more likely than not, these guys are also sending their forces down to deal with Orange Africa. And let's just say the overwhelming number of troops that we see enter into Orange Africa is a little bit too much for them, and they end up losing their capital very early on in the war. From here, the forces begin to spread out more and target these other major cities, as convoys of troops and mechanized equipment began to spread out from city to city in a webbed linked kind of conflict map. But this more so highlights the unorganized military of Orange Africa, who at this point is being absolutely slapped. Now up north in the more Saharan-ish kind of regions of the country, there isn't too much fighting happening because, well, it's geographically not necessary. But for the sake of filling in the country and showing that it is indeed losing, we're going to just start to fill in some of this area where fighting likely wouldn't happen, but West Africa could send up, a few divisions into just to raise their flag here and there. Eventually, they will just start to fill in this more empty area of Orange Africa, but the real fighting is going to begin once they get closer to these other major cities, both up here in the north, as well as, and most importantly, down here in the south. This is where we begin to see the fighting from the West Africans begin to slow down as Orange Africa's forces finally start to put a stop to their advance, as they aim to protect their major cities and eventually also pull the nationalism card, which of course they're a fascist country, so they're going to do that no matter what. But they start to use the narrative that West Africa is an evil betrayer of the orange people and that they need to rise up against West Africa and their puppet government. That's what they call it, because America's influenced West Africa to the point where they're joining the war, of course. So they're using that fact to go ahead and get people to conscript into their army, and it's just, nationalism at play here. Fight back against the evil aggressor, the American puppet state, the former ally, and now arch enemy. Now, this little movement actually is going to work for the Orange Africans, as the surge in the number of people who are joining the military is helping them in pushing back against the West Africans, and technically also the Europeans. Although at this point, it's probably mostly just the West Africans, as the European nations want to save as many of their troops as possible. So the counteroffensive by the Orange team is technically successful, although it isn't successful when it reaches the major cities, because the West Africans have once again dug in and have stopped any advance of foreign troops into these cities. So at the end of the day, the Orange Africans are mostly just liberating empty land. But now jumping back over to North America and the front between America and California. Yeah, okay, so we all knew this was coming. The American army has finally arrived to the unsuspected front, and pretty much all of California's invading forces are repelled, other than this area down here near this major city, but work will soon be done there. America isn't too happy that California joined this war, because they did hold pretty close trade relations with California. Now, as far as like the diplomatic relationship between the two, relations were mostly neutral. California was a big opposer of American imperialism and often voted against them in General Assembly acts against America, or like retaliations against them for doing their imperialism. And America knew that, they just didn't know that China was building as much influence in California as they had, and hence when the war broke out and California joined, America was like, whoa, wait a minute. But they're not really too worried about it. Sure, they lost a few defensive forces and eventually also lost a major city, but at this point they have been able to fully push back all of California. And as Mexico nears the capital city of West Africa in the south, the Americans begin to invade into California. And this invasion is an all-out frontline in this specific area, as America looks to target not only California in this invasion, but also West Mexico, hoping to reach over here to the Gulf of Baja, or no, the Gulf of California, not Baja, I don't know why I said that. But American forces will eventually take this major city over here in Californian territory, and American and Mexican forces will meet up on the border of West Mexico, and eventually American forces will stop their advance. They will fill in the rest of this area in California, but they won't enter into West Mexican territory, and that's because they are sending forces down into West Mexico to help Mexico capture this capital city. So forces will begin to surround the capital city, and the West Mexican government will go ahead and flee. But the military will not, and the fighting happening here is the largest battle of the war so far, as West Mexican, Chinese, and California troops fight up against American and Mexican forces. Eventually though, the red team will be successful in taking this major city, and the capital of this country is lost. Upon the capturing of the city, American forces back up north will continue their invasion of both California and now West Mexico, as forces stationed in California cross the border and meet up with the Gulf of California. The American forces will invade a little bit into this area, but they leave the most of it to Mexico, who will go ahead and occupy the entirety of it. So at this point, West Mexico has pretty much been eliminated. They are still holding on just a little bit, but the main fighting is now shifting over to California. Now over here in the Caribbean area, the fighting between the American and Brazilian Navy is going on, and it isn't going so well for Brazil's Navy. As we know, America has one of the most superior navies in the world, and they are using it right now to reclaim some of their lost island territories that Brazil won in their previous war against each other. But now that that war has been fought, and both sides have learned a little bit about each other and navigating the terrain of each other, things could get very interesting if America ever so chooses to invade Brazil. But now back over here to the front line between South China and Vietnam. Chinese forces are now arriving in Allied territory, and they use this opportunity to retake two of the major cities over here in the east, as well as this major city over here in the north of the fighting. But the current strategy is just to push back the Vietnamese in this more critical area and use it as a staging ground to start an invasion of Vietnam, which is exactly what they do as both Chinese and Southern Chinese forces begin to move into Vietnamese territory, taking over two major cities. Now back over here on the front line between China and India, things are no longer going in India's favor, as Chinese forces have now entered into their country and are doing a very good job at invading. Now previously I did say that the forces were pretty balanced, but after China finished off Korea, they reallocated some of their military to come down here and to help out India, to come down and help out against India. And that is proving to be very efficient, as they capture one Indian major city and use their allies' territory to also start invading into this former Bangladeshi land. Eventually reach down even further and capture two more major cities, but also, and more importantly, they will reach over to the Bay of Bengal, splitting it into two pieces and isolating this area over here, from which China will use this opportunity to invade even harder into this more specified area, as Indian forces go ahead and retreat via the ocean, and these two major cities over here fall to Chinese forces. Now China has a direct border with Vietnam as well, which they will use to start invading into Vietnamese territory along with their ally of South China. Now refocusing on India, Indian forces are still being pushed back by Chinese forces as the enemy pushes through Bangladesh and starts to threaten these two major cities down here. Now back to the topic of the Assembly of Nations. We're going to stop talking about the fighting for like a minute, and we're going to talk about what the Assembly of Nations is doing. So disregard all of the assembly nations that are currently involved in World War V. Instead, we're going to be talking about all of the non-participating states. So that is like a majority of Africa, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and then like Southeast Asia, specifically the island countries over here. They're meeting along with the other Security Council members that aren't involved, so Ireland, South Africa, Greece, and Tibet. And a decision is eventually made by both the Security Council and then also the General Assembly. So Ireland proposes this idea. The other Security Council members agree to it, and then it is presented to the General Assembly, who also agrees to it. So the plan will be set into motion and the Assembly will go quiet. For now though, we're heading back over here to Sub-Saharan Africa as the counteroffensive of the Orange Country begins to fail and West Africa pushes right back into this territory, now taking these two major cities over here in the south and pushing along the Ivory Coast. Additionally, up north, we see West African forces capture this major city over here. Now though, and with the help of a request from West Africa to send more European troops to the theater, the added help means that Orange Africa is going to be absolutely destroyed in the upcoming weeks of this war, as they lose all of their southern major cities. And after these remaining two are captured, the country will make the decision to go ahead and surrender. And a major power of the Triangle team has already fallen, and they lose the 1v1 with their former ally. Back over on the front line between Russia and the Pink team, it is, well, finally going good for Russia, as they do exactly what they wanted to accomplish earlier, and they cut the Pink team into two pieces, isolating any troops and citizens down here that were rebelling against Russia and forcing them to escape into the Caspian Sea, as the more dominant Russian forces begin to flood the area and retake their land, eventually kicking the Pink team completely out of this area. Now, the forces in the Caspian Sea, where are they going to go? Because they don't really have access to the Pink team, they don't have any border with the Caspian Sea, and there's no other participating countries in this war around here, so they're kind of just stranded in the Caspian Sea, theoretically on a bunch of Russian naval vessels that they might have stolen, but they will eventually find refuge in one country, and that country just so happens to be one of the countries that is helping with the refugee crisis that this war is creating, as many citizens begin to flee their countries in fear of getting drawn into the conflict. That country is the Red Mesopotamian country. So how does Russia feel about the fact that the Red Mesopotamian country is harboring enemies of the Russians? Well, they're not too happy about it, and you can imagine the response that the Red Mesopotamian country would give to the Russians. Remember, these two have historical relations with each other. But now, with the Russians kicking the Pink team out of their territory completely, the full-scale invasion happens as the Pink team loses its former capital city, and Russian forces begin to rapidly invade into their territory. It is pretty clear at this point that the fact that the Pink team is landlocked and is having trouble receiving supplies from their allies means that Russia is going to have a much easier time than originally anticipated by the 3-Point Star Alliance, as now the Russians are on the horizon of both of these major cities, which just so happen to be the last remaining front line between the capital city. The northern one will be taken, but the Pink team is successful in repelling the invasion near the southern one, and now we head back over to North America. We're seeing two major things happen here. One, we see the Mexicans make a landing in southern Baja California and begin to move their way up this peninsula, taking both of these major cities and pushing the West Mexican army all the way back up north until eventually they are kind of forced not to surrender, but instead are forced to merge forces with the Californians, because at this point West Mexico has almost been completely decimated. Now, as for the American forces that are invading into California, they are still doing that, and they are still doing it very well. It's just that California is a very large country, a very vast country, and not a lot of their population can be met until they get over here to the coastal areas, which is what we see America trying to accomplish here as they move across the country and take major city by major city until eventually they meet the Sierra Nevada mountains, which are going to cause a little bit of a slowdown. After it is discovered that American forces are failing to cross the mountains into the broader Californian area, and the logistics of it are pretty much thrown out, they'll shift their focus to the northern area, and more specifically in capturing these two major cities in the Great North, as this area is full of resources that America could find useful, not only for their own economical purposes, but also for military purposes. They will take this major city, and California starts to lose its northern half as American forces flood in. They will begin to round out this area and fill it in, as there really aren't any Californian defensive forces, and they'll meet the Sierra Nevadas once more. And at this point, they work with their ally in Mexico down here in the south, sending troops right into this area and capturing both of these major cities, and eventually completely occupying all of West Mexico. So now the Triangle Alliance has also lost a member, not only in Orange Africa, after the 3-Point Star Alliance lost a member in Korea. In the next couple of weeks of this war, American forces will begin to push up against the mountain range, and eventually, once all of their forces are ready and they have occupied all of the land to the east of the Sierra Nevadas, they will finally be able to cross over and start to invade into the more core Californian territory as the former Dutch colony of the Americas begins to resurface itself. Remember, pretty much all of what you see in purple here, apart from like Alaska, was a part of the Dutch Empire's colony in the Americas. Maybe America has a claim over all of that. Maybe they feel like they should unite the entire former colony. Anyway, with major city after major city being lost by the Californians, they will eventually make the decision to surrender to American forces. And just like that, the North American theater has already closed. Now America and Mexico will be shifting their focus to the south as they and Brazil begin to plan against each other and start the Second American-Brazilian War. The meteor landed right around here and had some detrimental effects on this area. As you can see, it destroyed the coastal areas and flooded a good portion of the blue team, where a lot of their population was. Both this city and this city were completely destroyed. And remember, humanity began right here at this point. So now this is now referred to as the point of humanity by the world. But a lot of the infrastructure and population centers in this area were overall wiped out by the impact. And additionally, there was a series of floods that occurred, tsunami waves that came from the impact, which flooded the coast of Ethiopia and the coast of India all the way over here, and even had lasting effects over here in Australia on their westernmost coast. Thousands and thousands of people died from this impact, and it is the largest meteor impact recorded in WICSO history to this point. The blue team will be forced to move their capital city out of this little city over here, which is severely damaged, and they'll move it to the complete opposite side of the country, going all the way over to here and placing the capital city on the coast of the Red Sea. That is where the government will take place for now until they can get the repairs in this city done and they can get this area habitable again. And remember, this happened during World War V, so like everyone's been fighting each other, and then all of a sudden the blue team gets hit by a meteor. That's kind of unlucky, but it also delays the time of investigation, so not a lot of investigation is going into the impacted area to discover more about the meteor that hit the Earth. For now, most people are still worried about the world war at hand. And that is especially because Egypt will be joining in on the Triangle Alliance on the side of China. Now, I do believe that their reason for joining should be pretty obvious. Egypt is a victim of American imperialism, especially over here in the Suez Canal/Strait area, where American forces previously moved in and occupied the whole thing from Egypt. Now though, with an entire global war happening, Egypt sees this as the perfect opportunity to take the Strait right back, and that's what they begin to do as they take over the actual thing and start to move into the Sinai Peninsula. But we also have to remember that Libya is in this war and on the side of America, so when they find out that Egypt has joined the wars, they immediately start to send their armies to the east and start invading into Egyptian territory, immediately threatening this major city all the way over here in the very top of the northwest. They'll send in additional forces down here, while Egypt attempts to take over the remaining areas over here, but finds trouble in capturing the city, which American forces have gone ahead and kind of locked into. Now, Egypt will request help in this war. More specifically, they're going to start to try to call out to their Mesopotamian allies. So they call it to Sudan, who will consider their call to arms, but at the end of the day, they will not be joining. And they call out to Palestine, and they call out to the Purple Country, both of which countries are going to deny, stating that Mesopotamia is currently in an age of isolationism and they have no interest in getting involved in this global war. They have no interest in just, getting their people riled into another global war. They want nothing to do with it and they want to focus on themselves. That is the policy of the Circle Economic Alliance, and obviously Egypt didn't get the memo. Now remember, this isn't a military alliance, so they're not obligated to help Egypt at all. So Egypt will not be getting any help from anybody in this war. They are on their own. But as it turns out, that may not be the worst of things, because Egypt is stronger than Libya, and they're also stronger than the Mediterranean country. You see, this area is a very historical portion of the old empire. It's very developed, and there's a lot of people living here. Egypt is more developed than Libya, and at this point, they're also technically more developed than the Mediterranean country. So once Egypt finishes its encirclement of this major city over here and begins to starve the American troops that are holding out, their forces will begin a counteroffensive against Libyan forces, which goes extremely well, and almost all Libyan invaders are pushed out of the country, other than the ones all the way up in the north near this major city, who have dug themselves in. Egyptian forces will now cross the border and enter into Libyan territory, immediately taking this major city right on the border, before starting to send their troops up north, aiming for this major city, and also aiming to cut off these troops over here, who will slowly start to back out as Egyptian forces begin to overwhelm them. So with Egypt seizing the Suez Canal, it now means that the 3-point Star Alliance, which is America's side, no longer has access to the Red Sea because the Triangle Alliance now controls access to the Red Sea. So they are controlling the trade that goes through here. They're controlling who goes through here. And that is a huge loss for the 3-Point Star Alliance, because now if America wants to help out India, they either A, have to go through the Panama Canal, which might be a little bit tricky considering that this is owned by Panama and also owned by the Assembly of Nations, or controlled by or managed by the Assembly of Nations, who may not let military vessels through. So if that's the case, America has to go all the way around Africa to get to India now, which is less than ideal. Now though, moving over here to the front line between Russia and the pink team, things are going to continue to go well for the Russians as they capture this major city down here in the south and begin to push back against this pink team offensive. It is fairly clear at this point that the pink team is completely isolated from their allies and have no real means of connecting up with America or India or anybody. Their best bet is to go through this southern territory down here to go through their economic alliance to get to India. But at this point, the economic alliance is being declared as neutral. They're going to differentiate themselves from the 3-Point Star Alliance because, as you can see, there's a lot of similarities between the alliances here. India is the founder of the Diamond Alliance, and they're also a prominent member in the 3-Point Star Alliance, but that hasn't necessarily transferred to these guys being military allies. So the pink team moving supplies and resources through these guys is actually pretty unlikely, and more likely than not, they're getting less and less resources from their allies as this war is fought on. But if things couldn't get any worse for the pink team over here in the Kazakhstan area, China is adding yet another ally to their alliance, and this time it is the light blue country up here next to the seafoam green country, and also, more notably, to the east of the pink team. This is another nation that has joined due to the result of influence building, and now the time is right. As they open up another front in the pink team, one that is completely unexpected, they soar through and take over this major city and start to head towards the center of the country with the hopes of meeting up with the Russians in the capital city. The pink team will now have to split their army into two groups. I mean, there is definitely a defensive group on the border of the blue team, but not enough to hold back the entire army of this country, as well as the entire army maybe of like the seafoam green country, the gold team, some divisions from China, so on and so forth. This isn't just the blue team doing this. This is the entire Eastern Triangle Alliance doing this. So yeah, it's not going to go so well for the pink team, who was completely unprepared and taken completely by surprise. They lose very many major cities in the upcoming weeks of this frontline opening, and as that happens, Russia starts to ramp up their attack in the pink team territory over here, moving through the more populated areas until they eventually reach the gates of the capital city of the pink team. Now at this point, they will start to diversify their invasion just a little bit. They'll send some troops up north to occupy this area, which they do, and they'll also start to send some divisions down south with the focus of capturing this major city and also moving towards the center of the country to link up with the blue team over in the east. So yeah, as you can see, the pink team is falling at this point, and once again highlighted by the fact that they're getting little to no help by their allies. Now though, taking a little break from this front line, we're going to come down over here to South Asia / Southeast Asia, where China and South China are fighting up against Vietnam and India. Now, for the most part, China and their allies have the advantage in this region due to the fact that China is the strongest country in the world, and they also have a ton of allies over here in East Asia compared to just India, Vietnam, and Persia, who are the only countries in the 3-Point Star Alliance on this front line, as you can see here. There's also the purple team down here, but let's be honest, they're not really doing too much. Anyway, India is able to pull off a counteroffensive in the Bangladesh area of this country, saving these two major cities that were definitely at threat of being taken by Chinese forces. They now invade up to this region over here, which is the 5-city region. As you can see, there are 5 cities here. Very informal of me. But China's defensive forces in this area are outshining India's offensive forces, meaning that an invasion into any of these cities at this point is not likely. What is likely though is Vietnam actually having a counteroffensive against China as they're able to take back this major city, and then also capture this major city from South China as their forces advance further into Orange Team territory. Now that does seem like things might be going Vietnam's way, but the truth of it is that a majority of the Orange Team's troops are down here in this area, and that's because they're aiming for the capital city of Vietnam, which they are rapidly approaching with the help of their Chinese allies. At one point, the city is almost completely encircled, and then we have the South Chinese and the Chinese making a naval landing, which captures this major city over here and expands the front line even further. And eventually, enough troops are poured into this region to complete the encirclement, starving the capital city of Vietnam and forcing them to surrender. Now, Vietnam's capital city might have surrendered, but their forces do not, as they continue to fight up against South China and Chinese forces. They will continue to lose major cities, as that does seem to be the primary target of the Triangle Alliance, While over here, their forces do start to experience a counteroffensive, one that retakes this major city and pushes straight towards the Vietnamese border. So while India is having a lot of success right now, Vietnam certainly is not, and that's because China is targeting Vietnam over targeting India. But now we need to take a slight break and talk about the Assembly of Nations. This is a very important thing in this war, or it's going to be a very important thing in this war, because of what they've just done. In the previous episode, the Assembly of Nations drafted a plan and put it into action as to how they're going to stop this global war, because remember, I've said this so many times during this war, but the main point of the Assembly of Nations is to stop global war from happening. They might have failed at first, but there's still an opportunity for them to make up the chance and to stop this war from reaching any kind of conclusion. The plan that the Assembly of Nations has put into action has just reached its full-on fruition, and the plan stems from a little bit of research and a little bit of investigation that the Assembly has been doing. You see, the elites of America and China are pretty well-known people. The richest man in the world lives in America, and the second richest man in the world, who used to be the richest, lives in China. They are pretty much the complete owners of the military-industrial complex in both of these countries, which has led them to become extremely wealthy, but it also has given them a ton of influence in the government. In fact, these people have so much power, influence, and money that they might have been the ones who kind of pushed for their countries to annex certain areas of the world. By doing so, these elites took control of some very, very valuable land, of which they have only profited from. And while that might just seem like capitalism at heart, there's more to it, because the Assembly of Nations is now going to go ahead and uncover the truth. The governments of America and China are serving the elites. They're not serving the people. They don't care about you. They care about the money, and they care about the powerful, the wealthy, the top 1%. Once again, your governments aren't serving you. They're serving the elite. At this point, can you even call your country a democracy? Look around. Look at the surveillance camera. Look at the contracts that your government is signing with these organizations. Look at what they're implementing. Read the congressional bills. Does this actually serve your interest, or does it serve the interest of the elite? Does it serve the interest of the powerful, the top 1%, the people with all of the money in your country? Do they care about you? No, of course not. You don't make them enough money. But the elites do. And when the Assembly of Nations begins to run this propaganda campaign in the countries of America and China, but not only America and China, because there's a series of other countries that also have very powerful elites in them that are influencing the government. We'll see more of that later. But when they start dropping these propaganda pamphlets across America and China, or more so start broadcasting it, the people begin to gain class consciousness. They begin to become aware of the situation in their countries and how the government doesn't care about them, they care about the elites. So America and China begin to experience civil unrest. Protest. People begin to protest in the capital cities, in the major cities. They begin marching and speaking out against their government. These are democratic countries, so there is no such problem with such. That is expression of protests, expression of, freedom of speech, which both America and China allow, but the sheer number of people who are protesting the government is record-breaking. Some of the largest protests in history are taking place in both America and China right now, and it's for the very reason that the government feared. They have become conscious, and they know the allegiance of the government is not with them. They want change, and they want the elites gone. America and China are once again democratic nations. They're going to allow for the protest to take place, but as the numbers begin to accumulate and more people take to the streets, it begins to kind of get out of control. But then a large blast is heard from the southern corner of the world, a blast that hasn't been heard since the conclusion of World War IV. The capital city of Brazil is completely destroyed. The American Navy has just successfully deployed the non-nuclear high-radius bomb for the first time in WICSO history, and the blast that this bomb carries is bigger than any nuclear bomb ever detonated before. The capital city of Brazil is essentially vaporized. It's gone, destroyed, and the people here are all dead. Along with the capital city of Brazil goes the dictator of Brazil as well, and many other high-ranking government officials from Brazil. We have to backtrack a little bit. Ever since America finished off California and West Mexico, they have been building their military presence in the Caribbean, and they have a ton of troops ready to go fight in Brazil. What's also been happening, and what we haven't been looking at, is the naval battle between America and Brazil, which has been ongoing since the beginning of this war. America has the best navy in the world. It's geared for long-distance invasions, long-distance operations, and it can operate hundreds, if not thousands of miles from their coast. America's Navy has pure dominance against any opponent in the world, including China. Now, while the American Navy could go over to China and do some damage, they're more focused on the people to the south of them because America feels like Brazil is the bigger threat to them in the future than China is. China's on the other side of the world. Brazil is in their backyard. So the American Navy has slowly but surely been building up their dominance along the coast of Brazil. And after almost completely destroying the entire Brazilian Navy, America achieved naval dominance in the South Atlantic. What they did next, though, was far beyond anyone's expectations. A specialized boat that no one has really ever seen before was seen off the coast of the capital city of Brazil. Now, of course, the major cities of Brazil have been being shelled and they've been being bombarded by American naval forces, but that specialized boat had a silo on it, and that silo fired off a missile. Brazilian military forces just thought it was going to be a part of another missile barrage. It did look kind of bigger than any other missile they've seen, but they didn't think that the non-nuclear high-radius bombs were ready to be deployed yet, but that is where they were wrong. For the first time ever, Brazil will take the floor in the Assembly of Nations and plead for them to get involved. They feel like this is a very direct violation of the non-nuclear treaty, but it is not, because the non-nuclear treaty outlined nuclear bombs, not non-nuclear bombs. This is just a weapon of war, and thus the Assembly of Nations can do nothing. Suddenly, even more blasts will be seen across the northern coast of Brazil. One is seen over here in Colombia. Another hits between these two major cities, wiping both out. Similarly, one hits down here, wiping both out. One hits between these three, wiping all three of them out. And finally, this major city is eviscerated, leaving both of these two very damaged. To further emphasize the sheer just power of these bombs, the capital city of Brazil, like I said, is gone. It has been completely vaporized. So are these two major cities over here, this one here, these two down here, and all three down here. Millions have died now. And with those millions, thousands upon thousands of Brazilian soldiers have also perished. American troops will then start to take claim to Brazilian coastal areas as their troops begin to move in, and I guess a better word would be to pour in, taking over Brazilian territory and taking over Brazilian cities, which at this point have been completely evacuated out of fear of being hit by the NNHRB. American troops will have an extremely easy time moving through this territory that has been decimated, making landings where there are ginormous craters, and quickly moving out and taking over nearby major cities. Landings are seen pretty much everywhere that America bombed, and Brazilian forces are failing to mobilize against it. With an open hole in the dictator's spot, a power struggle begins in Brazil, and some of the autonomous regions in Brazil begin to want to break away. Remember, Brazil has annexed a lot of countries. They haven't disappeared, they're still here, they're just in Brazil. So with an open spotted dictator and a rapidly invading foreign force, the communities in Brazil are now pushing for independence. They're pushing for local forces to rise up. They're pushing for military forces to come home and rise up against the Brazilian government and to reclaim the sovereignty of their nation. On top of that, America is also directly funding these groups of rebellions that want to pop up. With the events that have occurred in Brazil, America is now the strongest country in the world. They have something that China doesn't. Bombs that are capable of destroying entire cities, and not only the cities, but miles upon miles of suburbs that surround the cities and even some rural areas further out. These are extremely powerful bombs. How many does America have? Well, they've used 6 so far, and there were 10 that were sent over to India, meaning that so far there's been 16 confirmed, but how many more does America have? Well, that is kept top secret, and no one even knows where they're storing these bombs. Now, that event took place right after the AN announced that America and China were being run by elites and their governments had an allegiance to the elites. After America did that instilled a little bit of fear in the public, but at the same time, it also instilled a little bit of hatred, a little bit more hatred towards the government, and a little bit more of a desire to change things. America's protests are becoming more and more rowdy and more violent, much faster than that of China's. Now though, we're heading back over here to Egypt, where they will finally be able to take over the major city that America has been holding out in. That's a pretty good victory for them, and following it, they will start to push back Libyan forces even more, now entering further into Libyan territory and taking over this major city here, eventually also reaching to this one and capturing it as well. Egyptian forces now start a bigger front line into Libyan territory. But hey, guess what? West Africa sees this and they begin to send their troops over to fight back against Egypt, since the forces of Libya and the Mediterranean country are not enough. Back over in Central Asia, Russian forces will reach the capital city of the Pink Team and officially capture it, leading to the leader of this country to flee down to the south as Russian invading forces start to overwhelm Pink Team forces in areas of which the Pink Team used to have an advantage. They now sweep all the way down through the south and start to head towards the middle 3 major cities. Following this, we also see the blue team capture these two major cities up here, isolate the northern part before then taking over this major city. And after a few more days of fighting, we have the pink team's government making the call to officially surrender over to the triangle team. This is an extremely big deal for the war because now America has lost one of their only allies in Asia outside of India and I guess the four down here. The pink team was extremely important for keeping the Russians at bay. Now they can send forces into China to help out against India. Now they can send forces to deal with Europe or maybe even North Africa to help out Egypt. But sneakily enough, while the Russians are still working on occupying the pink team, a country swoops in at the greatest of times. Norway, having experience with this area in World War III, will make a landing in the Estonian islands over here in the far west regions of Russia. This isn't just the army of Norway, no, this is also the army of many of these Western European nations who've been waiting for this moment and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. They then land in mainland Estonia, take over a major city, and slowly but surely the Norwegians as well as the Western Europeans begin to sink in the Russian territory. Now they have a long way to go. Russia is a huge country at this point, but so far so good. They've taken over pretty much all of the former country of Estonia, liberating it as a republic and releasing it as a state, though such a state will not be recognized by the Assembly of Nations at this point. Anyway, a new front line opens in Russia, and they'll have to be dealing with that for the upcoming episodes. Back down over here in the lower quadrant of the map, Red Australia is actually going to be doing something. Now, previously I said that they were going to be a support country, and that is still standing true. However, they're also going to start to go on their own endeavors because this is the perfect opportunity to do so. Who's going to stop them? The Assembly of Nations? They couldn't even stop World War V. I mean, how are they going to stop Red Australia? Red Australia will begin to send their forces into their claims in Papua New Guinea, and eventually it becomes very clear what they plan to do. They plan on finishing off the Yellow Country. Having no true allies to help them out, the Yellow team couldn't do much to prepare for this war. They saw it coming, but there's simply nothing they can do as the top 10 power in Australia quickly moves into their territory, taking over their capital city and reaching the northern coast. The Australians will then start to move over towards their westernmost regions, taking over these two major cities, which will eventually lead to the Yellow team fully surrendering over to Australia. No one dared to step up to help the Yellow team, especially not the Indonesian countries, who at this point are going to hope that Red Australia doesn't have them on the menu because there's not much they can do. There's no regional allies that they could acquire that are powerful enough to hold off Red Australia, and with Australia being an ally of China, that makes things even worse. So Australia will be fully annexing the Yellow team, and their empire grows slightly larger. Now, over to Europe, the Americans are going to be trying to recruit Poland and the Golden Team into their alliance. They believe that these two countries should just join because look, I mean, you have an alliance formed at stopping Russian expansion into Europe. As you can see, Russia is an aggressor. They invaded the pink team and they invaded so many other countries around them. When they eventually build up enough power, they're obviously going to take both of you on and they're going to win if they're strong enough. How about you join me now during World War V, finish off Russia or help me finish off Russia, and not only do you defeat a powerful enemy, you get land spoils as well. Poland and the Gold Team will not even consider this. They want nothing to do with the global world order that has been established. Poland especially wants nothing to do with it. They still feel betrayed by America. They will refuse and they will remain out of the war. Once again, they want nothing to do with this world war. Similar to how Finland wants nothing to do with it. They just took it a step further. They completely left the alliance. They were like, nope, we don't want war. And that served them well so far. Now, though, we head back down to the Brazilian front line, where we finally see those rebellious communities start to rise up and take arms against their government. I said it could happen, and well, it's happening. American money is flowing in, and that money is suffice enough to actually make these rebellions start to manifest, and numerous communities / former countries across Brazil are going to start to rise up. More specifically up here in the northwestern quadrant, we have the former country of Colombia breaking away from Brazilian forces and starting to do exactly that. They rebel against Brazil in an attempt to go ahead and reestablish their country. They're being helped out by American operatives at this point who have promised them that they will leave their territory alone and even recognize them as a country should they rise up. But this promise wasn't only made to the Colombians. It was also made to the Ecuadorians, who begin to rise up against the Brazilian government. And what we see happening with these rebellions is something that is absolutely spectacular. Not only are the ethnic people of these countries rising up, but people who are even a part of different groups, not belonging to these rebellious groups, are rising up with them, helping out their group to beat back the Brazilian government. As it turns out, the Brazilian fascist government wasn't very caring of its people, and all of the annexed territories that Brazil took, they were constantly, trying to assimilate these people to be Brazilian and to just, completely abandon their old ethnic heritage and stuff like that. They were trying to assimilate them into Brazilian culture and Brazilian culture only. You could not have any ties to your history because you are now Brazilian. This is a lot more preferable than to what some countries would have done in that scenario. But when you try to forcibly take away people's identity instead of giving them the choice, well, that just leads to hiccups later on, especially when you start to get slapped around by the strongest country in the world, and also that strongest country in the world starts to fund those people who don't like you too much. Now we see groups from the pink Peruvian country also start to rise up, and these guys have a very special hatred towards a certain country in the south who is currently laying claim over to the majority of their country. That is the green team down here, who isn't even like the original government of this region. Remember, the green team moved into here recently, but they want to reestablish their country. These are the people of the north. They want to get down to the south to get a full-on country going. For now, though, these groups will be relying on the Americans to keep them alive and to keep them afloat, and both America and Mexico will be solely prioritizing the war with Brazil, leaving the rest of the alliance to fight on their own, of which they have full confidence in. They trust their allies and they believe that they will prevail. At the same time, China is beginning to grow a little bit worried. Yes, they have the advantage over here, but if Brazil were to fall, that would mean that the Americas now shift their focus over to them, and that might be a little bit too overwhelming, especially if India is still here. So China will begin to expedite their forces. They want them to rapidly start to invade, but they don't do it in a very careless way. No, the Chinese military is very disciplined. So when they aggressively start taking territory, they're doing it in very modern tactical ways that are not costing them a lot of troops, but instead a lot of resources, which China has plenty of. They now establish complete control over the Bengal coast, which is something that India definitely didn't want happening. Additionally, back over here in South China, we have the Vietnamese forces being completely pushed out of this country, allowing for an all-out front line to be created as Chinese forces start to storm into Vietnamese territory, now targeting over here in the western area where a lot of Vietnam's forces aren't too focused. This is recently annexed land, is a little bit less assimilated and thus a little bit harder to control, but Vietnam has a much bigger issue. As you can see, they've lost their capital city and day by day are losing more and more square miles of land. Vietnam looks to be on the verge of defeat, but they hold out for now. Over here in the Estonian front line, we have Norwegian and Western European troops finally reaching over here to what is in real life St. Petersburg, but in the WICSO world is named something else. They reach over to that city, they meet up with Finland, and they establish this front line, which spans all the way from this sea up here, or this lake up here, down to the very most eastern point of Poland. It's at this point in the war, though, that the Assembly of Nations reveals yet another shocking truth. And it all comes back to Rome. Rome was being squeezed by the Assembly of Nations, but more specifically, it was being squeezed by America. The communist country, more likely than not, would have survived after World War IV, would have been able to rebuild themselves had it not been for the Assembly of Nations and the restrictions that were secretly being imposed by America in exchange for influence over Western Europe. A deal was made between America and the Western European countries. America will secretly try to squeeze Rome of their money and their economy and fund rebellions in Rome, which will in turn allow for old countries to come back, as well as the Western European countries to take additional land from Rome. And Roman influence goes bye-bye. One of the more powerful countries in Europe that are going to not like you and are going to work against you is now gone. And in exchange for that, you guys are going to be in my sphere of influence. We're going to become very close allies, economic allies, and when the time comes, if I need it, your support will be mine. And that is a deal that Western Europe accepted. So all the time that Rome was collapsing and America was trying to be on their side, trying to bail them out, it was actually for nothing, because America was rooting for their defeat the entire time. When the Assembly of Nations voted to get involved in the Roman conflict, America abstained. They said they didn't want to get involved. They said they should be left to Rome. That was just a little act by them to make them look even less suspicious. America is solely responsible for the collapse of Rome. The phony agreement that was made between the two, which gave some Roman islands over to America, that was just another facade. That was another way that America was trying to gain the trust of Rome, making themselves not look like the country that was responsible for all of this. Now, what about the other Assembly of Nations countries that got involved in Rome's little collapse? Well, Greece didn't know about that. Greece didn't know about America's plan, and Greece comes out and says, we had nothing to do with that. We just did it out of pure love of the game. We don't like Rome. They're historical rivals after all. That's Greece's justification for getting involved. They want to clear their name. They don't want any association with what was just revealed about America. Now, what about the Romans? What do they feel like when they hear this news? Yeah, that's a fair reaction. Rome will join the war on the side of China, the most nationalistic country in the world, the nation with the most pride within itself. The people here are just disgusted by what has just been revealed to them. Their history recently has been shaky at best. There's been a lot of internal dialogue and a lot of internal dismay with the government, but this is different. This is the betrayals of betrayals, and justification enough to get involved in a world war which Rome has no business being involved in. Now, Rome wouldn't just join this war by themselves. Of course not, that would be pretty stupid. Rome knows that they could get in trouble with Western Europe, so Rome brought in backup. The Farmers' Republic joins the war on the side of China. Two nations that have been wronged by America, that have been abandoned by America, that have been abandoned by all of their allies, two nations that are sick of it, sick of the world order, and have chosen a side, believing that China is the better option and China will lead the world to a better future, and thus the American empire must fall, and thus we join the Triangle Alliance. The joining of these two countries is completely unexpected. Who would have thought that the Farmers' Republic would be fighting on the same side as the Russian Empire? But at the same time, a familiar return to history appears, as Rome will be fighting up against ancient rivals and former allies in a quest to redeem their country. But further down south, things will continue to get better for the Triangle team, as countries like Sudan have changed their mind. They now see this a little bit differently. They now see that there is maybe a little bit of a better side than another. Even though China and America are mostly guilty of the same crimes, America has done slightly worse. The whole thing with Rome is kind of a tipping point for a few countries. So they changed their mind. They're going to help out Egypt now against this 3-point star alliance. And so will the blue team over here in Africa, an extremely weak country, but a country that thinks they're fighting for the right side. They join the war and will be helping out their allies in the region against Libya. On the only border that Rome shares with an enemy nation, we see German troops enter into their country. However, this little incursion is very short-lived due to the fact that the Alp Mountains are here. So Rome sets up a geographical defensive line that helps them survive a little bit longer. In the meantime, though, they are going to be getting their army up and ready. They were already kind of prepared because, I mean, who doesn't have their army on high alert when a world war is happening? But they need to put some final touches on it and make a better plan as to how they're going to fight in this war. More so, what role are they going to play? Now that we're heading back down here to the front line between Egypt and Libya, and this front line is starting to shift a little bit in the favor of the 3-point star alliance due to the fact that the Western Africans have sent their armies over here and are now fighting against Egyptian forces as well as Sudanese and Central African forces. Their advancement into Egyptian occupied territory goes very well. In fact, they are nearing the border of Egypt already, and Egyptian forces are being very overwhelmed at this point. They do hold out in the north here, and they also hold out in the south, and of course they do still occupy all of the Suez area. Heading on over here to the front line between South China, aka North Vietnam, and normal Vietnam, things are wrapping up very quickly. China has stopped its full-on advance into India and has instead decided to reorganize some of their troops and to focus on taking out Vietnam as soon as possible. Once Vietnam is out of the way, that's going to open the doors for South China to help out China in their war against India, and that would be very, very helpful. So China will set up a defensive line between Tibet and the Bay of Bengal while they send a majority of their military forces over to South China to invade into Vietnam. The first little change that we see from this movement is over here on the border between China and Vietnam, and it goes extremely well. We have China going all the way down this coast and taking over these two major cities. We also see that the South Chinese capture these two major cities over here and then eventually are able to take over this major city. Vietnam has a lot of major cities, maybe a little bit too much. Anyway though, the Chinese duo is doing an extremely good job here because the Vietnamese military at this point doesn't really know what to do. Their government has essentially collapsed at this point. The capital city is long gone. And what we see is that like the federal government just keeps city hopping from city to city because they just keep getting taken. Eventually, South China has a really big encirclement down here, which is, it's going to be a very bloody battle. The Vietnamese troops here fight very fiercely, just not fiercely enough. They eventually are overrun and are forced to evacuate through the ocean down over here to the Malay Peninsula. Meanwhile, up north, we have Chinese forces cleaning up this area and taking over any minor settlements that may still exist. They also take over this major city down here, and little by little, the full-on front line moves south into Vietnamese territory. Back over on the front line with India, though, they have taken advantage of the fact that China has less forces in the area and are pulling off a pretty good counteroffensive, taking back this major city over here in Bangladesh, and also threatening to take back these other major cities. However, they are stopped by defensive Chinese forces. Now, I need to comment real quick on the state of the world, and more specifically, what's happening in America and China, because remember in the last episode, I talked about how there's protests in these countries, and these protests are just over time, they're gradually getting more and more larger and more violent. Violent as in the people there are demonstrating a little bit too hard. There is a line between protesting and rioting, and the protesters at this point have kind of crossed over that line a little bit, and they're more in the rioting territory, which is going to make both America and China deploy their military to deal with the protests. Not the police, not the National Guard, the actual military. Tanks can be seen rolling down the streets of American major cities, and the same happens over in China. Additionally, we also see very similar, just not as large scale movements happen in West Africa, with some military forces being deployed around the capital city. And even in India, we see the National Guard be put in a lot of the more populated major cities where there are some protests. Now, the protests in India are nowhere near as bad as the protests in America or China, but at this point, a lot of the people around the world, and especially the people in the larger countries, are just, becoming more aware of the situation in their country. They're becoming more aware of the whole gap between the ultra wealthy and, the typical average citizen. The Indian elites aren't as bad as the American and Chinese elites, but they are still elites. The only country where we see elites that don't have any kind of, just small scale protest at all is Red Australia. And that's because they're fascist, and if you protest against the government there, you get shot on sight. So don't do that. And then there's Brazil as well. I think we should probably talk about Brazil. They're in a full-on mini civil war at this point. They have multiple ethnic groups within their country trying to break away and reform their lost sovereignty. The people in these movements have picked up a key word to call themselves. They call themselves the Sovereigners. And like I just said, it's because they want to reform the sovereignty of their country. So while we're over here in Brazil, let's go ahead and continue to move this front line, because it is continuing to move. American forces are still pouring into the continent, and due to the deployment of those NNHRBs, the Brazilian military, government, and infrastructure system is in complete ruin. Not only have these, non-nuclear bombs been deployed, but we still have the American Navy just barraging the coastal areas, destroying any military and infrastructure targets. This is 10 times worse than anything Brazil saw in their initial war with America. And in a more specific area, over here in the easternmost area of Brazil, we see a high concentration of American troops be deployed. This is where the main invading force is actually located, not up here in the north. It is surprising for a lot of military experts around the world, because of course you would want to invade what's closest to you, but just the pure dominance that the American Navy has in South America is allowing for them just to land wherever they want. Now, of course, they can also use Brazilian ports that they haven't destroyed for their own uses, but not only is Brazil struggling to go ahead and appoint a new leader, they're also struggling to get all of their military generals to do their job. So all of them would be fired if there was a leader who could fire them. Anyway, propaganda pamphlets are now being dropped all over the south of Brazil, specifically in this area down here where the ethnic groups don't exactly identify themselves. That's the wrong map. With Brazil, as you can see, there's a lot of different ethnicities in South America overall, a lot of different religions. But these guys in the south, they more stem from the Western European branch, while the ones up north are more from the African/Middle Eastern branch. But most importantly and overall, these are former countries that were annexed by Brazil. And, given the circumstances of what's happening to Brazil right now, and on top of the propaganda pamphlets being dropped on top of them by America, they feel that the time might be right. And what would you know? The time is right. We have a large ethnic community down here in the southeastern quadrant of Brazil breaking away and declaring their sovereignty, much like the different rebellions in the north have. Instantly, they have themselves 3 major cities under their control due to the governments in these 3 cities wanting to break away from the fascist Brazilian government. On top of that, we also see yet another group break away. This time, it's the orange group up here, and they also have these 2 major cities that are breaking away with them. Brazil is in a semi-collapsing state right now. They just cannot get everything together, and as the days go on, there's more and more countries in this specific region that are looking to maybe reclaim some past land. America is in negotiations and talks with South American countries that are not aligned with the fascists, and of course their main offer is restoration of old land. This is specifically going to capture the interest of the southern Argentinian country and also the dark red country up here. Both countries have suffered a lot of lost land due to the fascist neighbors around them, and it very well could be that we see them join the war on the side of America, but for now, we head up to the front line between Russia and Norway. Russian occupational forces have finished their occupation of the pink team. They now have that under their control, and now the main Russian military is making their way over to the front line between them and Norway. Now, of course, this isn't just Norway. There's also all the other Western European nations. So when Russia finally pulls off a counteroffensive, they do take back one major city, and following that, they also go ahead and encircle the northern St. Petersburg area, which leads to some of these Norwegian troops escaping into Finland, which, when Russia looks at Finland, Finland's just like, I didn't let them do that. They did that illegally. But secretly, Finland's probably complying with Norway and sending those troops back home. Anyway, this little front line over here here is once again going to be stalemated due to the influx of Western European troops that are now pushing back against the Russian counteroffensive. And now we move to the front line between Germany and Rome. Rome is pushing back. Congratulations, Rome. Yikes. The green team in northern Italy, as well as the pink Sicilian team, both joined the war on the side of America. Rome seems to have forgotten that America was the one that freed both of these countries. So when the leader of America makes a little phone call to both of these guys saying, hey, remember how we just got you independence? Come help us out. Those leaders are obviously going to say yes because they're in debt to America. But they are going to serve as a very good distraction and a very good way for the Western Europeans to properly send their troops into Rome. Because now they can send and stage their troops in northern Italy and invade down into the peninsula. Rome has been exposed. So Rome does what Rome does. They send their military in to the green team in a very crucial blitz. They're able to capture the capital city of the lime team and slowly start to maneuver into the north of the country until they finally meet those Western European troops that I was talking about. Meanwhile, in the south, though, another Roman army group had made advances into the pink team, also threatening to capture their capital, but they did not do it. Instead, they isolated this major city over here. And now we quickly pivot down south to Egypt. And they've all been pushed out of Libya. All right. Libyan forces re-enter into Egypt for the first time in a very long time, and instantly they capture this major city over here with the help of West African forces. We're quickly going to pivot right back on up to Rome. America has just fired on a protester. Not just one protester, though. In a major city just south of the capital, during a protest that the government is now considering a full-on riot, American military personnel opened fire on a group of protesters. Granted, the protesters were definitely provoking those military officers and might have been throwing like rocks at them and stuff like that, you know, normal protester stuff. But the soldiers gunned down not only the dudes that were throwing rocks at them, the entire crowd was gunned down. America will quickly move to cover up the story from reaching international discourse, but unfortunately, it's the era of modernization and the internet exists. So that thing is on like TubeU immediately. And quickly, all of the protests across America just become extremely violent and extremely large. A pollster group in America ran a poll and it says that 50% of total citizens in America have at one point participated in these protests. That's half of their nation. That is insane. The largest protest in the history of this world. Exactly 4 days later, another shot is heard, this time in China. In their capital city, the Chinese military also opened fire on a group of protesters. And much like America, this only escalates the situation. China will quickly deny that they had any involvement in the gunning down of those protesters, saying that it might have been a rogue agent that had done so. But conflicting sources and witnesses give a different story. They say that the person or the soldier that started the opening of fire, because after he did it, a bunch of the other soldiers did so as well, was wearing Chinese military equipment, looked Chinese, and apparently uttered something in Chinese before doing so. So now America and China are just full of protests, full of riots, and full of civil unrest. Eventually, the severeness of these protests and riots begin to spread to other countries, much like the original protest did as well. So now West Africa is experiencing a lot of riots. India is now experiencing riots. Maybe they'll have to deploy their military as well. But now going back to Rome, they begin to be pushed back. Slowly but surely, the Western European forces begin to overpower the Roman forces. And even though the Romans see victory in the south taking over the rest of the peninsula, the Western Europeans eventually break in. Immediately, they sever Rome into two pieces and capture 4 major cities within the first month of the operation. At the same time as that operation, much more was going down as they made their way down the Roman coast and captured 2 other major cities. Additionally, at the same time, we also see Germany do much of the same, and Rome quickly starts to fall in the north. Back over in Brazil, American forces are continuing to do what they want with Brazil, as little to no resistance stops them. At this point, different military generals in Brazil are starting to kind of move their own way. Now there's like a fascist council in Brazil that's kind of taken over power while they still like work to appoint a dictator. And they've been trying to give orders to the Brazilian military, although like it's just all over the place. So what we see happening is a lot of these Brazilian generals doing their own thing. And you know, obviously it's not doing so well because America is still just absolutely destroying Brazil. But for example, we have one of the generals going out, ignoring orders to go to the front line with America, and instead heading down south and wiping out a good portion of the orange group. He then makes his way over here to the front line with the green team and does much of the same, taking back a major city and eliminating a good portion of the green team. The actions of this general are going to inspire other generals to do much of the same. A general that was supposed to go up and fight Colombia is now invading into the pink team, defying orders from within, and what we see happening is more and more of these generals going out and doing whatever they want. It's clear that they're doing very good work as they command these, dozens and dozens of divisions to go back and take back this land. They are now proving to be much more efficient than the Brazilian Council. But then we have the Brazilian Council going ahead and declaring that all of the generals that are defying their orders are traitors. They've put out warrants for their arrest, warrants for their execution, and this is going to inspire something else. More specifically, these generals are going to declare their independence from Brazil. Now, this is a very confusing action because what do you mean you're declaring independence from Brazil? You're not necessarily a nation. So I guess a better way to define this would be that the military generals are now forming military groups, their own militias that are not serving the Brazilian government, but serving those generals. And all the generals have different goals. Maybe one of them wants to form a new Brazilian government, maybe another one wants to establish a military dictatorship across Brazil. Yeah, it's a whole bunch of everything. But this is the perfect opportunity for America to go ahead and just Swiss cheese through the rest of Brazil. Because at this point, Brazil has collapsed. The government is no longer functioning right. That little council/group that was trying to control Brazil has split into two pieces. And I guess a way to better define that would be to do this. Brazil is now in full-on civil war, full-on everything's falling apart, full-on every ethnic community wants independence, full-on everything has hit the fan. It is #over in Brazil. The special thing about this country was that it had the ability to rule over so many different types of people without ever incurring any kind of revolution, any kind of rebellion, until now, of course. And that's mostly due to their strong fascist government. They have complete control over everything, and hence they have complete control over all of their civilians. But when America dropped those bombs, everything seemed to fall apart. It has only escalated further into what we see happening now. By the way, this new government down here is still fascist, so these are two fascist governments fighting up against each other. And a little bit of that does happen, but for the most part, it's just America coming down and just sweeping everyone up. Now, what do the other fascist nations think about what has happened up north here? Well, first of all, Uruguay is going to leave the war and declare their neutrality, which leaves northern Argentina a little bit mad and a little bit shocked, but they keep on fighting. Notably though, with the exit of Uruguay from the war, we have the entrance of the red team into the war on the side of America. And their entrance is purely just to take back their old land, which they have lost not only to Brazil, but also the brown team. It's just that you probably don't want to mess with them right now. They just got out of the war, and they would definitely sweep the table with you in a 1v1. So for now, just focus on taking back your old land, which is exactly what they begin to do. We also see the purple team government here come down and wipe out a good majority of the rebellious forces that were under the control of the military general. While up here in the northern area, the same cannot be said, because this guy is on probably some stuff from Colombia up here, maybe. But he's taken over a lot of land. His divisions are severely spread out, though, which becomes his biggest blunder as both American and Ecuadorian forces move into the center of this occupied land and begin to destroy the military infrastructure of the region and also disconnect up a lot of the resourceful lines. Then it gives way for both America and the paint team over here to go ahead and start to take back some lost land in major cities. While over here in this theater, we see Brazil and America forces eventually meet up after taking out this one general. We're going to go ahead and leave Brazil here, though. We're going to come back over here to Southeast Asia, where we finally see China and South China take out Vietnam. Now, this process was a very lengthy one at first. Vietnam was doing an excellent job at defense. However, since the loss of a few more major cities, they have been on the complete collapse as South China fulfills the complete occupation of mainland Vietnam, while we have Chinese forces move down the coast and eventually take over the rest of the Strait of Malacca area, specifically their area as well. With Vietnam finally out of the way, China and the rest of their eastern allies will now focus purely on India. Now, in the meantime, while that Vietnam offensive was taking place, India did push back a little bit more than last time. However, like they saw before, they once again hit that Chinese stone wall and will no longer be able to advance, as now tons and tons of Chinese troops begin to come over to the border between them and India. Anyway, there's a meeting happening in the Assembly of Nations right now. It's pretty important. And the topic of the meeting is the fact that both America and China had just killed their own civilians while in the act of war. Diplomats from both America and China will be summoned to the floor of the Assembly of Nations to, I guess, try to justify their actions, and both of the diplomats will give a similar case. We killed our own civilians, not someone else's civilians. There was no humanitarian crisis here because this all happened within our own sovereign borders. You can't do anything because this was us. However, that is not necessarily true. The Assembly of Nations protects people regardless of the country they're in. And since America and China are both in a state of war, this can be considered a war crime. And so the Assembly votes. Do we take action against America and China? Let's take a quick look at the Assembly of Nations map. There are multiple Security Council members that are currently in World War V. In fact, a majority of the Security Council members are currently involved in World War V, and they will vote against America and China receiving punishment from the Assembly during World War V. America, Mexico, West Africa, India, and China all vote no. Tibet will abstain from the vote. And then we have Ireland, Greece, and South Africa all voting yes. Now what about the General Assembly? Well, they vote yes as well. So the General Assembly says yes, but the Security Council says no. What does that mean? Well, as it turns out, and under the direction of Ireland, Greece, and South Africa, there have been some secret meetings taking place in the British Isles. The topic of discussion was the Security Council itself. Is it too powerful, and should it be abolished? Ireland, South Africa, and Greece are all willing to give up their status of Security Council members if it means taking away that power from America, China, and others. The General Assembly is in almost complete agreement. And of course, I'm talking about the non-participants in World War V, so that's the Mesopotamian countries, the South African countries, in fact, almost all of the African countries, the neutral countries in South America, the neutral countries in Oceania, etc. Pretty much all of them are in favor of getting rid of the Security Council. At this point, a majority of the general body believes that the Security Council is just the world order. It's America and China's world order, and they have implemented it successfully and almost like without being caught. Of course, now they have because they're in World War V. But yeah, the Assembly of Nations wants to abolish the Security Council, and that's exactly what they'll do. So a decision is made to abolish the Security Council, which doesn't really work because America and China, as the other majority members, are going to refuse it. So now we're in a very confusing state. Is there a Security Council in the AN? Well, some countries say yes, other countries say no. Additionally, Tibet is still abstaining because they want nothing to do with this world war. So what is the Assembly of Nations plan? This doesn't really seem like it's going to accomplish anything, right? Well, no, not necessarily, but it will inspire something. In Florida, the groups of military personnel deployed in their 4 major cities all make a very stunning decision. They declare that they no longer serve America, and instead, they serve the people of America. And by this, they mean they are now in open rebellion. The American Revolution has begun. Thousands upon thousands of other military personnel stationed in American cities begin to defy their orders and fight back against their very own government. Enough is enough. This government doesn't serve the people, this government serves the elites. Similar revolutionary movements are seen throughout the state of America as more and more of these major cities begin to rebel, the military forces here choosing not to serve their leaders but to serve their people, as it should be. From Louisiana all the way up to Michigan, many of these military groups are doing exactly what they should have done from the start. America has finally woken up. No, I'm not talking about the government, I'm talking about the people. Quickly, the leaders of America will direct their forces to go deal with the revolutionary movements. I mean, at this point, we have an entire state breaking away up here. That needs to be dealt with. They're urging their citizens to bring up arms and to fight against these revolutionary movements to secure the sovereignty of America and to ensure that our country lives on. Except when the people go to pick up their arms, they're not fighting back against the revolutionary movements, they're fighting back against the government. It backfires. America set up checkpoints across their nation to give citizens military equipment to fight back against the revolutionaries. That turned out to be a horrible idea because now they're taking those guns and they're mowing down everyone in those military checkpoints. That idea was not a good one. Good job, American leader. He's going to declare martial law, and at that point, that is the breaking point. Now, a majority of American citizens are in favor of the revolution. But why are these revolutionaries so strong? I mean, really, they have taken over the entire state of Michigan and multiple major cities down here in the South. How can they be able to do this? Well, as it turns out, guess what? The Assembly of Nations did it. Their plan to stop this world war wasn't just to stir up civil conflict within America and China, it was to bring about full-on revolution against the governments. They want to break down the elites, and that's exactly what has transpired here. Now, these revolutions are only in America, and it is that way for a little bit, because the Chinese government tries to do its utmost best to censor any kind of information that is pertaining to the American Revolution, except they fail, because it's the age of modernization, and the internet exists, and once again, TubeU comes in the clutch, and people see the revolution in America, and they're like, oh, our turn. It starts over here in this peninsula as these major cities surrounding the Yellow Sea all go ahead and break away. The military personnel here are inspired by what they see in America and all decide to go ahead and say that they're now fighting for the people of China rather than the elite class that they have been fighting for this entire time. America and China never thought that the attack would come from within. Neither of them ever thought that their own people would rebel against them. They thought that they had done a good enough job at establishing a surveillance state to ensure that everyone stays in line, but that is just completely false at this point. These fake democracies are now experiencing true democracy. The people have spoken, and the people have had enough. Back down in Brazil, the fighting continues on, as now though we see that the new Brazilian government that has just broke away starts to instantly crumble as well. As it turns out, the people within Brazil are rebelling against their rebellious government. Everything in Brazil is cooked. The rebels are rebelling from the rebels. This is like the worst that it can get for collapse. Brazil, for the entirety of this series, from here on out, and including the past, has the worst civil breakup of any country ever. But with a revolutionary breakout back home, America is going to have to pull some of their forces out of Brazil to go deal with that. But on top of that, they also have to worry about these guys disobeying orders and breaking away, much like the domestic military has back home. Also, over in West Africa, we see a little rebellious group pop up. These guys similarly want to overthrow the elites in the country. Even though they aren't as prominent as the elites in America and China, it is still a full-on class revolution, and they're going to want to throw hands. Now, with the breakout of all of the revolutions across America, China, and even West Africa, the Assembly of Nations' decision to abolish the Security Council is looking a little bit more promising. That is 3 Security Council members that have internal revolutions, and if those revolutions are successful, maybe you can take over that country and then, vote in favor of getting rid of the Security Council, so on and so forth. There's a lot of potential with these revolutions, so the Assembly of Nations is going to give them every bit of resource they need, and it's even going to be sending troops to these countries to fight back against America and China. Now, is it a full-on declaration of war by the Assembly? No, it's not. It is intervention, though. Will there be consequences? Maybe. We're heading down to the theater in Brazil, where we have a few events taking place. First of all, in their ally of the Triangle Team, a violent revolution overthrow of the government takes place. The fascists are thrown out of power, and a good portion of the country realigns itself with the Pink Team, who is fighting for their independence up north. This leaves the remaining fascist powers in the Green Team extremely weakened. It leads to the Yellow country moving some of their forces in to secure the area. However, they do not meet the border of the actual rebellions up in the Pink Team. You see, the Yellow Team here is in a little bit of trouble. First of all, their ally down here has left the war. They want nothing to do with the war, and they're all on their own because Brazil is really not here anymore. They're barely holding on. So Yellow country has to make a decision. Are we going to continue to fight in this war and probably end up losing because of the overwhelming amount of forces that are against you in the continent now, or you can leave the war now, like the Brown Team did, and get away with this with very minimal consequences? The Yellow Team will consult amongst itself, and they will make a decision. They too will be leaving the war and exiting. As for their forces stationed in the Green Team, they will remain there, hopefully using it as a bargaining tool in any kind of peace treaty that occurs. But as for the rest of this country, the Pink Team is successful in reclaiming all of it. While back in regards to Brazil, things keep getting worse and worse. Their country no longer really exists. This is just the Amazon rainforest, and with it, the other half of the council takes full control. So this is once again a fascist Brazil, but it's never that easy. No, of course not. Back down in the south over here, we see that both Green Team forces, with the help of the Red country over here, take out all of the land that this general was controlling, and with it, they take him out as well. So now we only have the rebellious forces, or the Southerners, down here in the south. While over here, between the Ecuadorians and the Peruvians, they also work together to target and take out the military general that is controlling this piece of land, and they do so successfully. At this point, these countries are functioning as, well, countries. They are rebellions, but it is important to remember that these two groups were once countries themselves, and thus they are very easily able to take over the land they once controlled, since the people there sympathize with them instead of the military general or the Brazilian government, which at this point is not even the original Brazilian government. Anyway, with the other two fascist countries now out of the war, things are looking up for these groups in the south, because they can now go after the Brazilians without much of any resistance. And let me tell you, the work that they are doing is tremendous. These rebellious groups are incredibly strong, and it's because of the Assembly of Nations, who is helping them out by once again sending over supplies, troops, volunteers, anything they need, they have, including money. Now though, we do have to discuss the American troops in Brazil. What about them? Well, the American troops here are very, very disgruntled with their government, to say the least. In fact, they have just discovered some secret plans by the military, which they are going to quickly show not only to the Assembly of Nations, but also to the people of America. These plans included the bombing of American cities where the revolution has most of its strength, including Florida, across the Gulf of Mexico, all the way up into Michigan. There are plans to drop the non-nuclear high-radius bombs on American cities to completely destroy the morale of the revolution and to quickly clean up this mess. The military gets this, and that's it. It's over now. America is screwed. It is broadcasted to the American citizens. And oh boy, when I tell you this revolution is about to kick up. The people of the Caribbean quickly rise up against their oppressor, declaring their independence and declaring war on the elites. Every single island, with the help of the Assembly of Nations and the American troops stationed there, throw over the occupying forces, the annexing forces of America. They are gone. Back over in America, it starts to fall. The rest of Florida will break away, and with it, many of the major cities in the South. This is a particular movement down here, where the current government isn't too favorable. The rest of the state of Michigan will break away, and taking with it some areas in Wisconsin that were previously a part of a Canadian country who have seen enough. Eventually, we see full-on American states begin to break away from their country. This includes, but is not limited to, the Rust Belt section of the area, and also, like I just said, very prominently in the South. Enough is enough. Now, the American troops that remain in Brazil are not going to sit here and just give up their arms and go surrender to the Assembly of Nations. No, they have a new mission. And their mission is to go back home and to overthrow their government. This is hundreds and thousands of troops. Tons and tons of divisions, and they're all angry with their government, and they're going to go fix it. American troops will begin to pull out of Brazil, leaving the control over to the rebel forces, most prominently being Colombia, but they also leave a new Brazilian government, one that flourishes under democracy, and one that speaks for all people in their territory, not looking to conquer, but looking to unite. After the complete evacuation of American forces, the Purple Team does retake access to the Atlantic Ocean, but how much will it really matter when you're fighting an all-out front war? The walls are closing in for the fascists. Now though, we head over to Europe, where we have to talk about Rome. Despite the issues and difficulties of the Three-Point Star Alliance in the Americas, the European bloc is doing amazing. They have now reached down and captured the capital city of Rome. We also see a naval landing that is made by French forces that captures Corsica, and the stopping of advancing Roman troops in the south of Italy. German forces will break through the front line and take two major cities, now heading into the Balkan area of the country, splitting off this major city, and with it taking out a bunch of Roman troops. Eventually, the Pink Team will begin to push back, retaking their capital city and meeting the border with the Romans. The Western Europeans will meet the border of the Pink Team, and Rome loses in the Italian peninsula. Now, their last bastion of hope lies in the Balkans, where they have their oldest land and their core territory. Unfortunately for the Farmers' Republic, still weak from the Fourth World War, they just cannot respond to the power that the Western Europeans are presenting towards them. These countries have been experiencing economic flourishment. Some of the best economies in the world now find themselves in Western Europe, and that's mostly thanks to the Americans coming in and just rising them out of the ashes of World War IV. These are the American allies. They're very important to America, so of course they're going to ensure that they flourish even when America isn't around. And let's not forget the power of Western Europe. The Dutch Republic was just the Dutch Empire, one of the strongest countries in the world. Their military hasn't shrank that much, but even though the Romans won World War IV against the Dutch, it appears that the long game has been played, and it will be the Dutch that win the rivalry against the Romans as they hold out in one last major city. Centuries have passed since the story of the Purple Team has begun, but on this day, their book officially closes. The Western Europeans are successful in eliminating Rome, and now their forces look to enter into the Farmers' Republic, taking over two major cities after very, very quickly taking out Rome. We now head back up north though, to the front line between Norway and Russia, as this front line gets pushed back once more. You see, with the revolutionary outbreak in America and the complete betrayal of the troops, the morale of the Triangle Team could not be any higher. Specifically in Russia, where they are feeling the biggest presence of the Three-Point Star Alliance, and with America now looking weaker and weaker, the people are motivated to push back the Western Europeans and to secure their sovereignty. Norway begins to lose their front line in Russia as more and more land is retaken, and eventually the Norwegians are pushed all the way over to the coast, and eventually then to the tip of Estonia, where they will try to hold out, but unfortunately cannot any longer, and are pushed all the way out, now going back to these islands. Now the Russians are at a severe disadvantage in terms of naval war. They cannot compete with the Western Europeans, but they can when it comes to naval landings. They will use as many of their resources, as many as their troops, they will use whatever they can to stop the Western Europeans from making another landing in mainland Russia. We now head down to the revolution in West Africa. Although being funded by the Assembly of Nations and getting all of the support they can from the international community, this revolution is simply not strong enough, as West Africa retakes their country and kills the revolution. But that isn't the end of the story of dissent within West Africa. No, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, are still protesting. While they may not be in open arms against their government, they sure are doing as much as they can along the lines of peace. They're calling for West Africa to leave the war, to give up, and to rid their country of elites. We now head down to Red Australia, who is going to leave the war and get away with what they've done to Papua New Guinea. Red Australia sees that this war is coming to an end very quickly, extremely quickly in fact, and Red Australia doesn't want to let their people get any idea of breaking away, so instead of fighting on an international stage, they're going to be fighting on a domestic stage and putting down any dissent that their people are having. Remember, Australia is a fascist government, and they are going to be ruling with an iron fist. They leave the war behind and now focus internally, putting down any kind of dissent. We now head over to China, where they have just done some very unspeakable actions. Chemical weapons have been used against the revolutionary movement. This is a direct violation of very many international laws, but more specifically the Golden Convention, which outlaws basically killing civilians with chemical weapons, bioweapons, all of the above. You can't do that. This appears to be a move made by the government and not necessarily by the elites of the country. China has just kind of screwed itself internationally. Many countries, including their allies, will call out China for their use of chemical weapons, and the government, instead of admitting that they were wrong, they're going to double down. They will deploy the use of chemical weapons even after the international stage begins to watch them, and at that point, China loses very many of their allies. Manchuria will leave the war. The Sea from Green Country will leave the war, and the Gold Team will leave the war. China has now lost most of their East Asian allies, minus South China, who kind of has to keep fighting along because, well, without China, South China would be nothing. They certainly feel the pressure to keep helping out China, so they will continue to fight. Now heading back down to Brazil, the fascist government is absolutely cooked. 100% of the people in Brazil support the democratic government, and 0% of people in Brazil support the fascist government. When you have the support of absolutely nobody, how powerful are you really? The Brazilian military has been divided into so many different subgroups that it doesn't function. But what does function is the democratic Brazilian military, which is constantly taking in people who are fleeing from Purple Brazil, including military personnel who want to fight to overthrow their previous rulers. On top of this, pockets within Purple Brazil begin to break up and break away because there is a lack of any solid control. We see the rebellious ethnic groups also consolidate more land and power, eventually now declaring their independence and declaring their exit of the war. It is now a war simply between the Green Team and the Purple Team, and without people to rule over, the Purple Team sees itself having absolutely no power. The split council has no authority to do anything, and eventually, they will flee. They flee into the Amazon rainforest, and their fate is likely in the jaws of caimans and jaguars. The South American theater has come to a thundering close. Brazil has been liberated from the fascists, and multiple ethnic groups now see the light of day once more. The Red Team, having served its purpose, will now exit the war, and the clock continues to tick towards the end of this war. Back in China, multiple things are taking place, and none of them are good. The use of chemical weapons on revolutionaries has certainly scared some people, but it has also certainly inspired others. And interestingly enough, these people are near the borders of China's former allies. China's revolutionary movement has just picked up even more. Taiwan has now broken away, and under the inspiration of the American Revolution, the Chinese Revolution wants to do much of the same, not only overthrow their government, who has used chemical weapons on their people, but overthrow the elites, who are controlling everything. This creates a perfect situation for India. Chinese forces, who are now unsure of what to do, some of which going back home to fight with the revolutionaries, some of which just not doing anything due to being applauded by the use of chemical weapons against their own people. Yeah, the Chinese military, much similar to the American military, is very disgruntled. Now, unlike the American military though, the Chinese military is still holding their lines. They're still fighting against the Indians. They're not necessarily in full-on retaliation against their government just yet, but it's getting very close to that point. But the disgruntledness and the disorganization does lead India to push back and take back these major cities, and this front line begins to budge in the favor of India. Now, what about India themselves? What about the elites in their country? What about the people here? Well, once again, India is experiencing these protests, but India has done a very good job at deflecting the focus of people from the elites in their country to the elites in other countries. Like, for example, calling out China and the elites that are controlling their government, and the fact that the Chinese government has used chemical weapons on their people. Like, hey, we didn't do that, so we're not as bad as them. But some things are definitely going to have to change in India if they want to remain stable. And breaking news from Mexico. Something very interesting has just happened here. The leader of Mexico has just been removed from office by the Mexican parliament. Democratically. There was no kind of foreign intervention here. This was a democratic process that really has been underway for quite a while now, but was sped up very much so by the revolution in America and just the current state of the world. So Mexico's president is given the boot and a new one is put into place. One that is very concerned with the sovereignty of Mexico, and one that doesn't want to fight in the World War any longer. This new leader of Mexico will quickly sever ties with America, will sever ties with other countries that have elites running them, and will even put out arrest warrants for the elites in Mexico, calling for their prosecution for their crimes against Mexico and for their crimes against other countries around the world. The Mexican elites will attempt to flee the country, some being caught and some getting away, but Mexico will leave the Three-Point Star Alliance and will join with Ireland, Greece, and South Africa in voting in favor of the dissolvement of the Security Council. That is now 4 votes out of the needed 9. Only 1 more vote is needed to officially dismantle this thing. So the Security Council will go over to Tibet and they will be having a meeting in the capital city. Now Tibet is abstaining because they are terrified of what could happen to them if they were to vote to remove the Security Council. They surround not only India, but also China, both Security Council members, and both countries that want to keep their status as Security Council members because of this New World Order. So the Assembly of Nations, including the General Assembly, will vote in favor of a kind of military deterrence measure to keep India and China from going into Tibet should they vote in favor of dissolving the Security Council. Now remember, Tibet itself is a Security Council member, so they may not want to give up that power as well, but a little bit of negotiating and a little bit of talking and a little bit of promises maybe can be made to dissuade that opinion. So the army of the Assembly of Nations, so countries that want to voluntarily send forces to Tibet, will start to put troops on the border of China and India, and now Tibet itself will vote on the matter of their Security Council status. Will they continue to abstain, or will they vote in favor of dismantling the council? Back in Europe, we have the rest of the Security Council members awaiting their decision, and eventually the Tibetan diplomat will appear before the council. America, West Africa, India, and China will vote against dissolving the Security Council, while Ireland, Mexico, Greece, South Africa, and now Tibet will vote in favor of dissolving it. And now with a majority in favor, the Security Council will be dissolved. There is nothing that America, China, India, and West Africa can do about this. A failsafe was never set up for if something like this were to happen, and just like that, their little world order comes crashing down. The Security Council, created as a means to ensure the influence of the great powers, will now be dissolved, and the world itself will very much so cherish this moment. No longer do these Security Council members hold any kind of other power over the other Assembly of Nations countries. It is now officially even. Completely even. Without the Security Council, the elites lose a ton of power. They no longer have this status in their countries as slightly above these other countries. And with that, the Assembly of Nations has just done something very smart. Promises are made from the Mesopotamian countries, who are some of the richest countries in the world, as well as some of these Southern African countries, and also the Unitarians, that the debt that the Western European countries are in to America will be paid back by them. Their debt essentially will be forgiven by the Assembly of Nations if you lay down your arms and stop fighting this war. That offer extends not only to these guys, but to countries across the world. America and China are now at the complete mercy of the Assembly of Nations without that little Security Council. So who makes a move? Well, first of all, Norway does. Knowing their history and knowing exactly how their country got pulled into this little world war, the Norwegians are extremely happy to exit the war. Remember, the American government might have had something to do with their new government, and well, we can probably safely say that if that new government wants to stay in power and not be violently overthrown, it would be in their best interest to probably leave this war, and they do. The Norwegians are not too happy with their government, so they're going to have to work this out on their own terms. With Norway out of the war, Russia will be able to take back all occupied land, while the decision will be considered by other nations here. We see Japan leave the war, the Mediterranean country, and Libya would leave the war, which definitely creates some interesting tension between them and Egypt. However, that is now done. Libya will leave, and will likely be subject to punishment by the Assembly of Nations, who will also persuade the Egyptians and other African countries to follow suit and leave the war as well. Egypt is allowed to hold on to the Suez Canal though, that is rightfully their land. And so, only a few fighters remain in World War V, but now we zoom back in on America, where the troops from Brazil have just arrived, and marching from Florida up north, they now begin to approach their capital city, where the leader of America awaits. The troops will eventually reach the outskirts and fight up against loyal forces, but they are simply overwhelmed by the amount of people, and the capital city will become under occupation of the revolution. The revolutionaries will enter the government building of America, and they will find the president, who turns himself in, and will be taken to the International Court of Justice to be dealt with. As for the rest of the country, the revolutionaries continue to fight back against any of the loyal army, taking major city after major city, but alas, the support for the American government no longer exists. With the surrender of the leader, most of the people in this country are in favor of the revolution, and with the capturing of the government and other surrounding governmental institutions, the revolutionaries have successfully won against America, overthrowing the government and also sending out arrest warrants for the elites, who will also be prosecuted not only by American courts, but by international courts for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Eventually, all remaining loyal American military fighters will have to surrender over to the revolution, who is victorious in overthrowing the American government and restoring democracy that is true. A new temporary leader is then put into power, and that leader is the man from the Brazilian front line who first spread the news of the fact that America was planning on using those non-nuclear high-release bombs against American citizens in American cities. He was, in fact, the commander of the American offensive in Brazil, but he himself was probably one of the bravest soldiers on that front line, having the capability of going against his government, knowing that there very well could be consequences if it didn't work. But luckily for him, it did work, and now he finds himself in a position of power in America, holding over the temporary American government. Together now, he will meet with the leader of Mexico, and they will make a decision concerning the territories of which their forces occupy over here in California and West Mexico. And that decision is a pretty simple one. They will release control over California and West Mexico, and all countries in agreement will leave the war. America has left the war, and has also left behind their status of great power, as the country now looks to rebuild itself and to restructure its government and to track down and prosecute those elites. This is a monumental movement for World War V, which has now pretty much come to an end. With the exit of America, most of the Western European countries no longer find reason to fight. The Germans, the green team, and the pink team will still keep fighting though, and that's mostly because they do have some interest in occupying areas of Rome. Marvelously, the Farmers Republic was able to hold off the Western European forces for a very long time, thanks to a very special general who kept their country alive, and with brilliant strategy kept out the Western Europeans. We now head over to China, where the war looks to end. The continued use of chemical weapons against their own civilians is finally reaching a breaking point. Not only that, but China is refusing to prosecute against the elites in their country and refusing to do anything about the matter, promising no change even if they become victorious in the remaining war. Eventually, enough is enough. And the Assembly of Nations, now without the Security Council, and now without the need of permission from the Security Council, will pass a resolution to become directly involved in the internal conflict in China. Not only that, but a deal is brokered with some other fighting countries in the war, and more specifically, a deal is brokered with India. It basically says this: if you stop fighting against South China, stop fighting against the other Triangle member alliances, including Russia, we will let you out of this war without any consequences. You'll get away scot-free, like it never happened. You will not be allowed to annex any land, and you may be required to give up some old land, which belong to some, sovereign nations. But other than that, the actual state of India itself will not be touched, and there will be no consequences. This plea is taken by India as well as some other surrounding allies, and it's also taken by West Africa, who will also leave the war. Now though, as for Russia and the Cyan team over here, they're a little bit more hesitant to accept any kind of deal, and especially Russia, who isn't even in the Assembly of Nations. But the Cyan team wants to make sure that they aren't, sending their troops to die for absolutely no reason. So they make the Assembly make them a promise that they can take a little bit of land from the pink team to make up for all their lost forces, and the Assembly of Nations will reluctantly allow for that to happen. You see, the role of the Assembly of Nations in World War V is certainly a very interesting one, because they recognize it as a conflict that got out of control and out of their hands, and therefore they can't really do too much to stop countries wanting to take land from one another, because once again it got out of their hands. So they're going to go along with that. They're going to allow for a peace treaty of World War V to actually take place, but they will be stepping in at different intervals to prevent certain things from happening. So they're okay with the pink team losing land because they recognize that the war between America and China broke out, and that countries participated for different reasons, and not all countries are subject to the whole elitist control thing. Some countries join out of their own interests, some countries join because of connections to the actual governments of these countries, and the AN is okay with recognizing that as a fact. So the Cyan team will leave the war. They are promised land from the pink team, while Russia, not really having anyone else to fight, will also leave the war, Also, promised land from the pink team. With that statement made by the Assembly of Nations, fighting will cease in Central Europe, and a deal will be worked out between these countries and Rome and the Farmers' Republic, which now leaves only one theater remaining, the Chinese theater, where the goal of the Assembly of Nations is to overthrow the Chinese government. As for South China, they are given a secret deal behind closed doors, which is a very interesting deal that we'll cover here in a second, but they leave the war. China feels very betrayed by that, but China probably knows what the deal was. Now though, with all surrounding Assembly nations involved in the war, China is facing a front line that spans from all the way over here, where the northern point of their coast is, all the way over down into where Taiwan is. Some of these countries are exhausted, some of them are not, but at the end of the day, this is a war that China certainly can fight, especially considering the internal struggle and the fact that the Chinese military at this point has now pledged allegiance to the Chinese citizens and vows to help the AN in dismantling the Chinese government, which a certain task force or division will successfully be able to do after taking over the capital city and ridding of the Chinese government, who will also be tried in Chinese courts and international courts. A new leader is put into place, and much similar to the American leader, he will set out arrest warrants for the elites of the country, and also like the American leader, will go ahead and go along with the Assembly of Nations and accept any punishment towards their nation. The remaining loyal Chinese forces will attempt to hold out, but at the end of the day, they begin to realize their fate, and the Chinese revolutionaries will be successful in taking over the rest of the country. World War V has now come to an end. The elites have lost, and democracy and the people around the world have won. In the pursuing days and weeks, the rebuilding will begin to be done by the Assembly of Nations to bring up communities and areas, cities, towns, everything that has been destroyed by this war. And eventually, every country will be invited to a peace conference, one that is ironically enough held in the capital of the Red Team. So now we take a look at the peace treaty of World War V. And in the peace treaty of World War V, we see very many changes across the map. Now, I'm hoping that I didn't miss anything, because when it comes to these big peace treaties in the Civilization series, sometimes I always feel like that I missed something, so I'm really hoping that I didn't. But this is our new world map. As you can see, a lot of things have changed. Comparing it quickly with the map that we were just looking at a second ago, you can see all of the new countries that have been created, all of the new countries that have been released. Ignore that one. But yeah, a lot of changes. More specifically, I want you to draw your eyes towards South America and America first, so you can see all of the major changes that have occurred here. Also check out Europe, check out Western Africa, and then of course check out China. That is where the most changes have occurred, I believe. Anyway, let's go ahead and better break this down. So starting in North America, we have the American Revolutionary Government taking over that country. We saw that in World War V, but now we have this peace treaty making America look something like this. Notably, they have spit out their occupation of California, and California has remained untouched from this war despite being involved. As for America itself, they have lost the gold team, which they and Mexico previously had annexed, so they have Mexico spitting them out as well. But we have some of the state of Texas breaking away. Now, this is kind of complicated in this manner because Texas doesn't really fully exist anymore. It's kind of been integrated into America. But what we have here is these faraway communities that still kind of align themselves with former Texan culture. So there's a little bit of like a tiny bit of a want for independence, and the Assembly of Nations granted them that independence. And it's kind of a similar case here with Louisiana, where there's some Texan culture over here in the western areas, but also just some people over here decided to break away from America. They didn't want to be a part of the new revolutionary government. They want their own independence in this region because this area is pretty economically developed. Now over to Mexico, they didn't lose any land. They were forced to spit out West Mexico, and they also gave up a little bit of land to the gold team, but other than that, they didn't give up any land. And then we also see the return of the Caribbean country who broke away during World War V. They were, granted their independence once again. Nothing else really to talk about there, other than their capital city being placed, which is right there. Now we move down to a very, very interesting region here. We move to South America, where Brazil has lost a ton of land. Some of these borders date all the way back to like 50 episodes ago, but a lot of the ethnic communities that wanted their independence have gotten their independence, so kind of a justification for these guys getting their sovereignty back. We take a look at the religion map, where we can see the religions/ethnicities of South America are very diverse. Brazil tried to make them all under their banner. That didn't work out so well. So the Assembly has recognized that some states just deserved their independence on their own, and there was a lot of these purple communities down here and a lot of the yellow communities over here. But we do see the return of some familiar faces, especially down here. We did see that northern Argentina did hold on to their land from the pink team. That's because they left the war, and the Assembly of Nations allowed them to keep that land because they left the war. They didn't go down fighting. So they respect that in a way. And then as for Brazil itself, of course, they are given a new government, a democratic one, which reduces the amount of non-democratic nations in the world heavily. Now, I did not fully update the ideology map. I'm going to have to work on that off camera, as well as like the technology maps. You can see that those are still not updated at all. I did try to do my best with the Assembly of Nations map. I believe I got most countries, but if I didn't, then I'll fix that off camera. And then also the alliances. We need to talk about that real quick. So all of the alliances that were involved in World War V have been dissolved, meaning that there are very little alliances left in the world. There's only South Africa's military alliance, which has 5 members, and then there's the military alliance between Poland and the Gold Team, which still exists up here in Europe to deter Russia. Other than that, all other major military alliances have been disbanded, including China's economic alliance, which wasn't a military alliance, but that is now gone. And you might notice that some countries are missing their economic shape. That is to be explained in the next episode. But now moving on over to Africa, where we have really only one change happening here. Let me fix this. This has been bothering me for a very long time. But the one main change here, of course, is that there is a new country which has appeared right here in the southwestern quadrant of the West African country. Now, West Africa has controlled this land for an extremely long time. There's no issue with like different ethnicities. It's nothing of that nature per se. It's more so that this was a group of people, an autonomous region of the West Africa, that didn't really feel like they were included in the government, which is located all the way up here in Morocco. West Africa is a very large and very fast country, and as it turns out, they mainly focus their attention on only like the Mediterranean and outer Atlantic regions. They don't really, I don't want to say they don't care, but they definitely don't support the inner areas as much as they do the outer areas. And this stems from a multitude of factors throughout the country's history. But the development of the coastal areas, and more so the northern coastal areas, has been a priority of the government, whereas like areas like this have been left alone. So you might also remember there was a revolution that happened in this general vicinity that might have had something to do with this area that felt like they were not getting enough attention from the government. So when the Assembly of Nations was supervising the peace treaty of World War V, they saw that these people wanted their independence. They were tired of being a part of West Africa, who didn't seem to care about them. So as a punishment for West Africa, because they didn't really get any other kind of punishments, they were forced to give independence to this autonomous region, and so we find them on this map. Also, you'll see that the Orange Country has been released and has not lost any land. Instead, the Assembly gave them a new ideology, kicking out that fascist government, and that was something that West Africa was okay with. If it meant that they didn't get any land, as long as they got a new government, West Africa was okay with it. We move over now to Egypt, where they retake their land from the Suez Canal away from America. And then as for the tensions and border between Libya and Egypt, there were no changes here, and the two countries are just going to have to work it out. Now, they both did willingly join this war knowing that they would fight each other, so therefore the Assembly was like, yeah, we're not going to give any of the other land. It was a pretty even war in the first place, so no border changes will occur here. However, now moving up to Europe, I'm sure most of you have noticed this by now, but there has been some major changes here. Rome is no longer with us. The Assembly of Nations, and maybe more so Greece, still held a slight grudge against Rome, and this was the perfect opportunity to finally do away with them. Remember, this was an extremely nationalistic country, one of the most nationalistic countries in the world, and they just kept coming back and they kept getting involved in these wars. So maybe Greece was the one to propose that the Romans were to be divided into two separate states, the northern and southern Roman/Balkan republics, and that is exactly what has happened here. So as for the Italian peninsula, that has been divided between the Lime team and the Pink team, and also as for the American islands, this one was given over to the Catalonians, and this one was given over to the Sicilians. Germany now finds itself a border along the Adriatic coast, and some slight border changes were made over here in the Central Balkan region. Now, you'll know that this dark blue country was not involved in World War V. However, they do still have land here, and that's part of the punishment of the Farmers' Republic. In fact, they lost land in multiple places. As you'll see, the old provinces of the Farmers' Republic, they did kind of span right down along here, and also even had some in here. Why were they forced to give those up? Well, the Assembly of Nations thought that maybe to satisfy the people of this region, it would more so align with the ethnic/religious map. These were communities that more so identified with the nations that were to the west of them than they were with the Farmers' Republic, so this slight change is made. It's not a huge loss for them, but they do lose a little bit of land. We now move on over to Russia, who gains land in the Pink team. Other than that, no changes. So I guess we're going to shift the topic to the Pink team then. We can take a look at first of all, we can take a look at the stability map to see what they used to look like, and all of the land that they have lost to the blue team and to the Russians. And this was just part of the compromise that the AN made with them. The pink team loses a bunch of land. And we now move over here to the most interesting area of the war, to China. Now, China has lost a ton of land, and now we can probably see what the deal that South China made with the Assembly of Nations is. So, looking at the stability map, we can see how their borders have changed. Yes, they have gained land from China, which was their ally in the war. Additionally, they've moved their capital city back to their old capital, so what exactly happened? Well, the AN swooped in and they were like, hey, we know how loyal you are for China. We know that you're probably going to keep fighting with them until the very end. However, we do have this deal on the table for you, which is basically, we'll give you the old Chinese land that they took from you. By the way, they stole it from you. We'll give you that back. Additionally, when we release the nation of Bangladesh, which that has happened as well, we won't take any of your land to give it to them, even if it was core territory for them. Basically, South China got out of this war scot-free, and they even got additional land from Vietnam, and then of course, once again from China, and also gaining Taiwan, who broke away from China. That kind of explains itself. Anyway, as for China themselves, they have lost land to a lot of people, not only South China, but they've lost 2 of their own breakaway regions all the way over here in the far west. And this is very similar to West Africa, where the inner, and in this case more rural areas of China, felt like they were alienated by the more urban center. If we take a look at the major cities map, you'll see that this is definitely an urban center compared to out here, which is very vast. But they just felt like with the whole Chinese revolution and all that, this would be a good time to distance themselves from the actual Chinese government and try to work on themselves, since the Chinese government doesn't seem to want to do that for them. Now quickly down to India, they didn't lose too much land. We'll take a quick look at what has changed. Well, they did lose a little bit of land. They lost their claim over Bangladesh, so they were the ones forced to spit that out, and that country has been reestablished, and it also joined the Assembly of Nations and is now a democracy. In fact, just to say, all countries released in this war are democracies, and all of them join the Assembly of Nations. Another thing you might notice is that the Seafoam Green country has gained a lot of land from China, and this was also part of a deal that the AN gave to them. Once again, if you join this war, we'll give you your old land back from China, and that's what's happened here. If you remember, a very long time ago, Russia and China attacked this thing, and they lost a ton of land, but they've now gotten the Chinese claims back. And then finally, we talk about Manchuria/Korea. We have them just taking a little bit of land from them. Korea was wiped out very early on in this war, and this was just like standard peace treaty protocol, so they don't lose a ton of land, but they do lose some valuable urbanized land up here. And now, and most importantly, we take a look at the map of the Assembly of Nations. You'll see that there no longer is a Security Council. That has been finalized by the Treaty of World War V, which took place in the Red Mesopotamian country. So the Security Council is dead. It's no longer going to be able to come back. It's forbidden to come back via this peace treaty. And you can definitely say that a bunch of countries are excited about that. So now the organization just functions as a parliament. Every country has one vote, and any country can bring up any issue, and the floor will be held for them. They can vote on the issue, so on and so forth. It now functions as a parliamentary international agent. Also, Australia does officially annex the Papua New Guinea country. This happened in World War V. It was kind of an offside thing, so it didn't necessarily pertain to the Treaty of World War V. It was an individual event, so I just want to clarify, they did annex Papua New Guinea. Anyway, the manhunt will now commence for the elites, who not only have warrants out for their arrest in their own domestic country, like the American guy or the Chinese guy, they have warrants for their arrest across the whole international stage. Every country that is in the AN has a warrant out for these guys, and therefore they cannot seek refuge in any of these countries. Additionally, all of their assets have been frozen, so that sucks. They're all super wealthy and rich. Probably not too happy about that if I had to guess. Well, yes, let the manhunt commence. The Assembly of Nations will now look to rebuild the world and look to bring up the new countries, such as the ones in America, the ones in China, the ones in South America. It's going to be an international effort to bring everyone together. And a very, very super duper, very important note to bring up is that World War V, the War of the Elites, has set a precedent for the people of the world, more specifically the people who are in the middle to lower class area, even extending in some cases up into the lower high class. Basically everyone that isn't super wealthy or everyone that isn't elite, there is a sense of commonality amongst them, a sense of belonging with another, and a sense of unity that has never been felt in the history of the world before. In many cases, people are now overlooking their ethnicity, their religion. All that minuscule stuff is no longer super important to people because they have now realized that all along it's mostly been them versus the ultra wealthy. No longer is that the case. Everyone feels equal now because there's no longer this big wealth disparity. And on the very topic of that,
many countries across the world are working to eliminate this major wealth gap. In real life, it is a major issue that will never be solved because of circumstances that this war kind of covered, wink wink nudge nudge. But in this world, people have developed enough, technology has advanced enough, and just overall strategies and economics has come to a point to where being poor isn't necessarily a thing anymore. Governments will now step in to help you out, no matter where you live in the world. In our world, people like to throw around the term third world country a lot. Now, I can go into a whole explanation as to why that doesn't actually mean anything in the modern context, but as you all know, third world countries, people usually refer to like poor countries as third world countries. And in this universe, there is no third world countries anymore because the Assembly of Nations, as well as other nations and communities, have come together to lift these countries out of poverty. The world is now rapidly advancing towards a future where every single human life, no matter where you live, is not left behind and is assisted and helped no matter the condition. Things are finally looking up for the world, and that is going to do it for this video. So, let me know what you thought in the comments below. What did you think about this world war? It's a little bit different than the other ones, and certainly it has a lot more meaning to it, but it's also laying the groundwork for future episodes, and this series is very quickly coming to a close. Now, what I usually do in these videos is that I do the ending of the war, and then I have a whole video dedicated to the peace treaty. I figured that since there's only 15-ish episodes left in the series, that I should probably not do that to waste a whole episode on just a peace treaty, because there's some very important things that we have to get to soon to set up the ending of the series. In fact, I'm now just realizing that I forgot a certain something down here, so let's go ahead and fix that. There we go. Yeah, we are getting super close to the end of the series. I'm sure you guys have a ton of questions, so do let me know what your questions are down in the comments below. I hope you guys did enjoy World War V, the War of the Elites. Let me know once again what you thought about this war. Let me know your rankings on the world wars in the comments below. I don't think I've ever asked for that before, so rank the world wars in the comments below. Let me know what you thought. And once again, thank you guys so much for watching. We are 1,000 away from 200K, so super close, and all the support to get us there is super appreciated. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next episode. And of course, thank you to all our super fans. This includes Andrew O2, Bruno Apex, Omega the YouTuber, Terminator, Aiden Shank, Icy Static FN, See What I Do, CTG on YT, AdizzPro, Euroball, Bren, Jazzy Gerboa, Green France Mapping, Nevada Garbage Trucks, Vista, Nightenhood 7353, Big, A Norwegian, RS, and Golden Ball Mapping, Zaylance, Laser Taze, Augusto, Pablo Sigma Cat, and Hammer Toad 45. Once again, thank you guys.